And now, our feature presentation.
One night, me and Mama was out shopping, and we walked right by Benson's Furniture and Appliance store. And guess what?
You ain't nothing but crying all the time. You ain't nothing but
This is not for children's eyes.
This scene from Forrest Gump perfectly encapsulates the juxtaposition of the early 1950s to the modern time period. Censorship throughout time has always come across as an unwelcome appeal to authority, especially in the United States. Robert Zemeckis, the director of Forrest Gump, used these recognizable historic events to help the audience relate to what was happening to the film, while also presenting them with the comedic presence of Forrest himself. Since Gump was so oblivious towards the impact he made on modern culture, it helps to document these moments by exposing the uninformed youth who are watching today to these more obscure parts of our history. There are several other instances of this, and seeing Forrest Gump's mom shield him from viewing Elvis's dancing is one of the best examples to show the effects of film censorship from the past. In comparison to the waves of hysteria towards heavy metal bands or rap music, it's hard to imagine that Elvis Presley's dancing, which is relatively tame in today's climate, would be the subject of censorship. The controversy surrounding Elvis is something that is often questioned by the generations that grow up today. With sensationalized violence and adult-type programming being available all at a click of a button, a man singing cover songs about girls and moving his hips is something that may perplex the modern person. On the Ed Sullivan Show, Sullivan famously did not want to have Elvis on since he was such a controversial figure at the time. Back then, Elvis was seen as the real-world representation of teenage angst, which was accentuated by his overly sexualized dancing style. At the time, this type of dancing was unthinkable. Parents did not want their children to be exposed to this, as they feared it would tarnish their growing, sensible minds. They felt the young children being exposed to this might cause teenage rebellion to ensue through the youth. A popular instance of censorship towards Elvis was his eventual appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. During this recording, they made a decision to only film him on the waist up, to keep with the more family-friendly theming of the show. This was not the first case of censorship because of a person's dancing, and in this episode of Film History Digest, we will go over the effects of censorship in film over the years, and how it eventually led to what we know as the MPAA. Let us begin. To fully understand the history of censorship, we have to go back to before the invention of the moving image, photography, and even the effects of the first working light bulb. One of the first true cases of censorship goes back to around the biblical period, where religious texts were widely disputed. This is one of the first widely published versions of censorship, and arguably the most popular. Religious censorship was also one of the main reasons why European settlers made their daunting voyage overseas to the Americas. Censorship is arguably one of the most important aspects to our past as humans, being the way that we have worked around censorship has often led to some of the most creative works of all time. The idea of free speech was something so important to the settlers that we wrote it into the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which this country is founded upon. And then we have film. In the past, people were hesitant on film and its lasting effects, thinking of it as just another fad. Film, just as any other type of entertainment, had to prove its worth and value to society as a whole. This type of behavior has been shown throughout history, with the video game crash of 1983 being a prime example of a mass sway in consumer opinion. We know how successful both video games and film have been. At this time, there was no knowing if film was going to last or not. It's the process of building it up which actually started the initial development of the Motion Picture Association of America, or MPAA. Thomas Edison, leader in the development of filmography research, tried to find new ways to innovate in this realm. As many of you might already know, his contributions to film are not really what Edison is best known for, but his employee, William K.L. Dixon, was. He helped to direct a number of projects for Edison, leading toward a number of firsts in the movie world. The 1984 short film, Edison Kinetoscopic Record of a Sneeze, is notable for being the first movie to ever be protected by a copyright. Some of his most notable works include the Monkey Shines movies, which were some of the earliest movies we have today. With the innovations Dixon made, he could be considered the first real film director. Although Edison directed a few of his own movies, Dixon was known more for being a director during this time period. With the first case of film censorship, remember how controversial Elvis's hip gyrations were? Well, more than 50 years earlier, Dixon was having to deal with a similar controversy with his short film, Carmencita, which was the first case of censorship in film. Carmencita became heavily censored in some cases by showing less of the actress, as not to offend people with her dancing and exposure of her ankles. This was the first real instance of film censorship. Moving forward, the film industry more and more started to develop into what we know today. In 1922, the first rendition of the MPAA, known as the MPPDA, or the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, set up versions of this censorship in order to ensure investments from the Wall Street investors and better public relations with the government. This fell in line after a landmark decision from the U.S. Supreme Court stating in 1915 that the exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, originated and conducted for profit, like other spectacles, and not to be regarded as part of the press of the country or as organs of public opinion within the meaning of freedom of speech and publication. With the MPPDA, they sought to govern the moral tone of film, as to show the more positive influence of film in the United States. This helped to mitigate the exposure of sexual and racist themes portrayed on screen, and led the government to take more control of the output of film. The main issue with the MPPDA's type of censorship was how loose the guidelines were, and the fact that studios and filmmakers rarely followed them to begin with. There were several types of guidelines and attempts to censor film over the years from the MPPDA and other censorship groups. None of these guidelines really took off in popularity, with studios and filmmakers being more loose with the types of movies they produced. It was not until 1930 when the first real rendition of the production code, often referred to as the Hays Code, started to get actual traction. This code, nicknamed after the MPPDA's president at the time, Will H. Hays, was the first case in which movie studios and filmmakers began to openly support the Hays Code and tailor their movie output to heavily suit these guidelines. The problem with the code was how restrictive it was, and how it created an output where every film had to follow the same narrative beats, opposed to full creativity. The rules that accompanied this text included some of the following: no expression of profanity in any form, the aforementioned accentuated dance moves, the exploration of anything related to sexual activity, any type of violent activity, and religious mockery. While this may have been harsh for the time, the code simultaneously approved of the depictions of real-life hangings, the branding of real people and animals, cruelty towards animals and children, along a strange list of exceptions only if done tastefully. The incorporation of sound into what was once thought of as a soundless medium is what is commonly cited as the reasoning for the censorship, as is mentioned in the Hays Code itself. These rules help to ensure against corruption of the youth, and sustain people from being able to recreate anything that may incite violence or any other act. The code began to see a change when the United States Supreme Court reversed their previous decision on how free speech applies to filmmaking. The Supreme Court put out this statement: expression by means of motion pictures is included within the free speech and free press guarantee of the First and 14th Amendments. That, combined with the movies Man with a Golden Arm, Blow Up, Baby Doll, and the invention of broadcast television, it was clear that it was time for some changes to the now renamed MPAA, inciting what is often referred to as the counterculture era. Jack Valenti, former aide to President Lyndon B. Johnson, became the head of the MPAA and began to see changes that needed to take place.
Hello, I'm Jack Valenti, and these are my cheeks.
In 1968, he discontinued the Hays Code and replaced it with a voluntary film rating system. The film Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, an adaptation of a stage play previously thought impossible to show on the big screen due to including sexual and violent moments, showed how successful a movie could be with these contents. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was nominated for 13 Oscars, being one of the only 2 movies in history to ever be nominated in every eligible category at the Academy Awards. Around the same time, Jack Valenti saw the limitations of the production code and decided to revamp it into something similar to what we knew today. The ratings were as follows: G, M, R, and X. The biggest difference between this system and the one we know today is the omission of the PG-13 rating, which was actually added due to a recommendation from film director Steven Spielberg after some parental backlash towards his movies. PG-13 has grown to be the best bet for filmmakers today, as it brings back the most investment at the box office. While this may be the case, many have criticized the rating for limiting creativity and mitigating the violence and content of more mature movies just to make a bigger impact at the theaters. The M rating has also had a lot of revisions over time as well, being rebranded to GP and then PG later on. The last biggest change to the MPAA rating system was the change of X to NC-17, as to differentiate the ratings from the porn industry, which it had become widely associated with. Through all of these ratings, it becomes difficult to graph which were the first movies to take on these ratings. There is actually very little documentation on film ratings as they applied to movies, and which ones received which ratings at which times. The first MPPDA approved movie was The World Moves On in 1934, which was before the changes to the system that Valenti made. The first movie under these new ratings was with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. What is also interesting about this movie is that it was not just the first movie to be rated under this new system, but the first movie to be rated G. With the graphic detail incited from a Dracula movie, it is still a little strange to see something like this movie in a category with some of the movies we would consider G today. It is a lot harder to follow the history of the PG rating, with the general consensus that Live a Little, Love a Little was the first movie to be given an M rating. With the movie starring Elvis Presley, it shows the fight he still had with censorship, even in film, especially being compared to the likes of Dracula. The first movie with the GP rating to be released was Ramparts of Clay in France. The first movie to have the PG rating that we know today is Cabaret in 1972. When PG-13 started, the first movie to get the rating was The Flamingo Kid, but it was not released till December, giving Red Dawn the classification of the first released PG-13 movie. The first R-rated movie was The Split. This film did not star James McAvoy, and instead followed a series of thieves having a falling out over $500,000 going missing. The first X movie was called Greetings, and is actually quite notable for being one of the first movies to launch the career of Robert De Niro. When NC-17 became instated, the movie Henry and June was the first film to have that rating. Ever since the beginnings of ratings, however, the dreaded X or NC-17 was always a point of contention in the film industry, as filmmakers felt it to be a death sentence to their movie. Over the years, there have been a lot of conversations about what constitutes being put into these certain categories. Trying to find out how to safely traverse the MPAA to get your desired rating has been shown to be difficult and created a lot of rumors and speculation over time. Something that is usually pointed to is the F-bomb.
Fuck anymore, 'cause fuck is the worst word that you can say, so just use the word okay.
As many people might already know, if a movie is PG-13, you can only say the F word one time without giving an R rating, which was even backed up by Joan Graves, who oversees the ratings board at the MPAA.
Nice fucking model!
That was a scene from the 1988 Tim Burton film, Beetlejuice. The catch? It came out almost 5 years after the initial implementation of the PG-13 rating, and still got a PG rating. In 2011, the popular David Fincher film, The Social Network, said the F word twice and still maintained a PG-13 rating.
Sorry, my Prada's and the cleaners! Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops, you pretentious douchebag!
Sean Parker says fuck you.
And the movie The American President even said it 3 times.
Why are you always one step behind me?
Because if I wasn't, you'd be the most popular history professor at the University of Wisconsin.
Fuck you! And I'm gonna make a list of everybody who tried to fuck us this week!
Lewis!
Yeah, well, just vote your conscience, you chicken shit lame ass!
Like the mandatory 3-day waiting period before a 5-year-old can buy an Uzi. Oh, fuck the sweater. She'll have to learn to live with disappointment.
This type of hypocrisy has led to a lot of frustration with filmmakers and studios. Since there are no set-in-line ways to follow these ratings, the MPAA has gotten a negative rep for censorship over the years, and none of which is more apparent than in the movie This Film Is Not Yet Rated. In 2006, the movie This Film Is Not Yet Rated tried to expose the secrets of the MPAA, and the unfairness that went along with it. The movie has amassed a mostly positive reputation over the years, although there are several questionable aspects to it. For example, in the movie, the director hires private investigators in an attempt to dox the people involved with the MPAA, which he puts great attention on in his film. He did this to shed light of the secrecy that the organization puts up without properly viewing the consequences of his actions. Through time, the MPAA has hired parents to give notes on the movies being shown, and the secrecy involved is to keep away public intervention from the lives of these normally mundane individuals. Not only does he show the houses of some of these people, he is seen digging through their trash and watching them eat. It's a bit, weird. He does all of this in order to show the public who are rating their films, as if that even matters to the common moviegoer. The main criticism they have with the secrecy of the MPAA is how difficult it is to get clear thoughts from them. Later on in this movie, they end up interviewing Matt Stone from South Park fame to talk about the difficulties they have had over the years, citing their work in Orgasmo versus a South Park movie as a clear indication of studio favoritism.
We got off this phone call with the MPAA, and the guy would basically say, it's for the overall sexual content. I said, was there anything we can cut out to get an R? You're welcome to recut it and send it back to us, and we'll certainly look at it again. And their whole position was, when we did this film, was we don't give specific notes, because then we'd be a censorship organization. We just give you the rating. And cut to 5 years later, we're doing the South Park movie, and now we're working for Paramount, it's a big studio. And we turned in the first cut of the movie, and we get a phone call, and you got an NC-17. Well, you need to cut out this, change this to this, and it was extremely specific. This word, this line, this joke. So our treatment was a completely different experience.
They also interviewed Kimberly Peace about Boys Don't Cry, and how she felt she was unable to properly portray this story after having to jump through all of these hoops to authentically portray an LGBTQ transgender standpoint. The main problem with this argument is the fact that these movies were already made. What does that entail? Well, let us go back a little to better understand what it means to be donned with an NC-17 rating. It is better to view these ratings as suggestions, as it is still possible to theatrically release a movie without an NC-17 rating. Just because a movie is NC-17 doesn't mean it's not going to get views, and chances are if a movie is to a point where they can submit it to the MPAA, then the studio and investors are going to find a way to get money back no matter what comes back from them. Popular online video creator James Rolfe ended up releasing Angry Video Game Nerd the movie across the country and even internationally. He did this without having any type of rating from the MPAA and was able to play it to sold-out theaters. The Dreamers was released theatrically as well, while still retaining the NC-17 rating. There is also more of a market for NC-17 home releases, with Showgirls becoming one of MGM's best-selling movies of all time. Even without studio intervention, it could still be argued that it's unfair for independent filmmakers without the backing of a large studio. With that in mind, can you remember the last time you saw an independent film in theaters? These days, theaters are reserved for the bigger Disney-type blockbusters, and have seen little success with anything other than the occasional religious outing. Less and less people want to see movies like Boys Don't Cry in theaters because the market has heavily shifted towards streaming sites and other avenues. Even with the issues Boys Don't Cry had with the MPAA, it was still released with large success and made back $20 million at the box office. So while it may be sad to see the end of theatrical experiences, it comes at the advantage of home entertainment at a moment's notice. With technology's continued advancements, we are beginning to see a large increase in creative expression, as we're being less limited by the industry and more by the advancements of our own mind. And the way things are headed, systems like this are going to eventually become more and more obsolete over time. With that being said, let us push that PG-13 rating.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Go fuck yourselves.
Hip hop, roo, rappity.
Joker was one of those surprises you could only get once in a lifetime. Coming out in 2019, it's very reasonable to say that it took the year by storm. With Joaquin Phoenix's groundbreaking performance and the Academy Award nominations leading in that year's awards, this was truly a force of a movie to be reckoned with. The way this movie surprised audiences with its cleverness and shaking commentary is something that had not been felt in previous times. The prospect of a film like Joker is one that has the stability to emphasize the lower class of civilization in order to comment on mental health as it applies in modern times. The message that the movie tries to show off is how each experience someone has could potentially lead towards the deterioration of their mental health. It shows the danger of mistreating the common person and the consequences of these thoughtless actions. As Arthur's character in the movie has already been shown to have dealt with past trauma, it's implied that the lower mental stability is what caused his initial spout of mental disarray, leading towards his inability to sustain any type of well-paying job. The main way this is shown throughout the movie is Arthur's blatant lack of proper treatment in his work, which is literally smacked over his head before we as an audience are even shown off the movie title, as though it's to say, laugh at this. While it may be sad to say, one of the reasons why this film performed so well is because of the fact that people were finding relatability in Arthur's character. With a global mental health crisis in adults and teenagers, this type of movie is needed to help the public understand what it could be like for someone to not properly deal with their mental issues. It's important to figure out that just because someone might feel like they're relating to Joker, it doesn't mean that they're any worse because of it. Creating a climate in which we stigmatize people that relate to this story only goes to worsen the problem and moves away from the subtext of the film. Being able to understand this helps to solve the issue before it becomes too big, which is what the main themes of the movie were trying to represent. When Joker came out, there were a lot of people who went in for a typical superhero action film, but left confused after watching a slow-burning drama which studies how this character grows throughout the movie.
We sat down to write a movie about empathy and the lack thereof in the world. We wanted to make a movie about the power of kindness, and that's genuinely where it started from.
As people watched the film, they started to realize that maybe this wasn't the Joker origin story they have come to expect, but rather a story about a man's lack of sanity and his mental state snapping under the pressures of society. And that's what makes a lot of this movie so powerful. Since this movie is left so open-ended, it leaves room for the audience to engage with it later on. This benefits with the interpretation of the relatability with Arthur's character, and how he contributed to the overall function of the story. While the upbringing of Arthur is not one that should inherently be relatable, there's a large number of people that have dealt with similar issues, whether we'd like to admit it or not. Part of that helps go towards building the authenticity of the world we see, and makes the movie feel like it has more of an overall message. To do this, however, the movie has to slowly show you how bad of a person Arthur really becomes.
Always remember, that's...
Making a movie based on someone you're supposed to hate is something that doesn't really happen too often because of the difficulties that come along with it. With another superhero villain movie like Venom, you can tell that the lack of relatability towards Eddie Brock or Venom is what made it come off as more shallow in comparison to Joker. The relatability of Eddie Brock didn't cast as many layers as Arthur Fleck had in Joker. The same reason why Joker works is the same reason why Iron Man works. When you're watching the Avengers movies, you always see Tony Stark, not Iron Man. Iron Man was never meant to be a character in his movies. Blending the line between the persona of Iron Man to Tony and Joker to Arthur is what makes them so interesting as characters. A lot of it comes down to the great performances by Robert Downey Jr. and Joaquin Phoenix respectively. They both do such a phenomenal job playing into these characters, and it ends up leaving a feeling that these actors were destined to play these roles. Whether you agree with it or not, that's just something that doesn't really happen in Venom. While these three movies are widely different in tone, scale, and execution, these little attributes go to truly show the positive aspects Joker has as a movie. Despite the positives of Joker, before the movie was released, it was slammed with reports that the film sensationalized violence. These reports were aimed mostly to compare it to the real-world event that took place during The Dark Knight Rises theatrical premiere in Aurora, Colorado in 2012, killing 12 people and injuring 70 others. With the themes that the Joker has, it makes perfect sense why people would be worried about this movie creating a negative real-life situation similar to what happened before. Even though Batman movies have had a stigma attached to them, it shouldn't inhibit grittier violence represented in the franchise. The specific case in Aurora was even commonly misrepresented in the media and had little to do with the actual themes of The Dark Knight Rises. Although this might have been the general understanding at the time, with the movie's release, people began to realize the true meaning that Joker's director, Todd Phillips, was going for. One of the main reasons this was the case was because people started to understand that even though Arthur was relatable, his actions were nothing more than despicable and idiotic. Todd Phillips as a director made sure to not romanticize his actions throughout the movie, even though it could be misconstrued. His previous works were not all comedies as many people have said, but rather dramas mixed with comedic elements. The main thing to realize about Joaquin Phoenix's Joker is he's still a bad guy through and through. What makes him such a compelling character though is the fact that you understand why he feels the way he feels. The characters in War Dogs, Todd Phillips' previous movie, are written very similarly. War Dogs is a great movie to point in Todd Phillips' filmography as it shows the general change in direction his films took leading into Joker. Miles Teller's character in the movie hides the fact that he's selling weapons to his wife because she was against the war. As with the conclusion of the movie, we find out the negative implications of what happens. The ending of the Joker represents that same mentality as it sparks the inciting incident of the entire Batman mythos. The movie shows more than anything the powers of insanity over the mind of a broken person. With the music of the famous bathroom dance scene, you get a sense of uneasiness that only starts to truly hit you at that point. The strings on the instruments, accompanied by the somber singing voices in dark, sinister tones, shows the reality of the situation and how much of a truly awful person Arthur is. Believe it or not, the real sadness that comes from Joker is the fact that you want him to get better. With his deteriorated mental state, it's easy to forget that shooting those businessmen on the train was an action that started out in self-defense. The main inciting piece of the movie was mainly dictated by how the world views what happened and not the story surrounding it. That seems to be the true meaning of the movie, and it's easy to get distracted from that point, like how Arthur does. With everything in the movie, it's truly inspiring to see something like this. Something that tackles mental health in a creative yet somber way. As deserving as this movie is, it's truly worth the status of an instant classic.
Oil is aware that the Soviet Union demobilized.
The American people are going to have to choose between the Bill of Rights and the Thomas Committee. They cannot have both. One or the other must be abolished in the immediate future.
Depends on you.
The time was 1949, only 4 years after World War II. With Japan's surrender and the end of the Nazis' rule, a new threat emerged: the atomic bomb. Tensions grew in the air, as a threat of nuclear annihilation upon the United States grew by the second. People feared to lose their jobs, countries divided in half, and communist rule was covering the globe. But as time ticks down by the second, so does the patience of the American people, and the workers in the film industry. This is the story about 10 people who stood by their American rights and continued to stand by the First Amendment of free speech. In this episode of Film History Digests, we're going to be going over the effects of the Cold War in cinema. In the past, the Cold War wasn't as kind towards the film industry, unlike the past wars. In World War II, Walt Disney Studios in Burbank, California, was actually where the houses of over 500 military soldiers were after the attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Walt Disney Studios was known to be the only film studio under military occupation in history. With the emerging fear that swept over the country in World War II, nobody knew what would happen. So in an effort to cheer up the nation, we began to see a surplus of Disney cartoons be applied as a part of a propaganda movement. Almost a decade later, the Cold War's effect would not only tarnish movie studios' respect with the military, but also create a climate where the movie industry was scared to interact with them. To understand this topic, you would need to understand 3 topics: McCarthyism, the effect of the Cold War in America, and the blacklistings. As many of you already recognize the Cold War, it's more crucial to describe the effects of McCarthyism, and why it plays such an important role in this part of history. As some media has come to show, like with Season 3 of Stranger Things or Indiana Jones 4, Russians were a huge scare of our past. Though Stranger Things is a fictitious sci-fi television show, the idea of the secret Russian spies infiltrating the States was a real fear for the time. In the 1940s, the United States did house a very small but active communist party. During World War II, there were American communists who spied on Hitler. During the escalation of the Cold War, however, communism became seen as a much greater threat to national security. This is what was seen as the embodiment of McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy, with whom it was named after, was the largest contributor to these scares, stating that he believed that 205 communists had infiltrated the US State Department. A lot of the fears of McCarthyism arose from the leaks of the top-secret Manhattan Project, originally so top-secret that Harry S. Truman didn't know about it. Truman was vice president during FDR's run in office, and president after his eventual passing. The Manhattan Project was the government's testing of the atom bomb, which eventually fell into the hands of the Soviets. Klaus Fuchs, the most popular of the Soviet spies, is the person responsible for supplying the Soviet Union with the powers to make the Cold War hot. Though the Soviet Union was already working on atomic fusion, Fuchs saved the Soviet Union 2 to 3 years of independent atomic engineering. With all that in place, it led to the eventual invasion of Hollywood. With the idea of McCarthyism running rampant throughout the nation, it started to become clear that the film industry was its next target. The House of Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, released a report which claimed that communism was prevalent in the film industry. 2 years later, former Communist Party member John L. Leach ended up naming 42 communist members lying low in the film industry. The reason why this was becoming such a prevalent issue at the time was out of fear that the communists working in the industry would brainwash negative ideologies across the nation through film. After Leach testified in front of the Los Angeles grand jury, the names of these government insiders were leaked to the public, which had then head chairman of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, Martin Dies Jr., state he would clear under certain conditions. Out of the several accused were Frederick March, a well-respected actor who won 2 Academy Awards for his work in 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and 1946's The Best Years of Our Lives. James Cagney, who won an Academy Award for his work in 1943's Yankee Doodle Dandy and was honored by the legendary director Stanley Kubrick while also being inducted in the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Humphrey Bogart, who won an Academy Award for his work in 1951's The African Queen and was also inducted in the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Katharine Hepburn, who actually holds the distinction of winning the most Academy Awards for acting with her work in 1934's Morning Glory, 1963's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1969's The Lion in Winter, and 1982's On Golden Pond, with 12 other nominations. There were other well-known Hollywood figures who were a part of this list, but these were some of the notable ones. It is also fair to note that not only were these Academy Award-winning, well-respected Hollywood insiders being accused of communist activities, but the majority of them had actually spent time serving in the military. As long as these actors cooperated with Dies by meeting with him, they would be free to go. It's fair to point out that there were other communists found in the film industry, but not much came from it. The most notable subpoena from the House of Un-American Activities Committee, however, which is the most synonymous with the blacklistings, is known as the Hollywood 10. In 1947, there were 79 individuals that were subpoenaed on suspicion of communist propaganda in their films. There were more screenwriters, producers, and directors this time, rather than actors, as previously mentioned before. The Hollywood 10 are simply 10 Hollywood figures that refused to testify to the committee about their political beliefs, citing the First Amendment. Though there were actually 19 who refused to cooperate, the other 9 were unable to appear in front of the committee. The remaining 10 were eventually tried and were found guilty, which they appealed to higher courts with no avail. All 10 were sent to federal prison and were scheduled to spend a year-long sentence. The Hollywood 10 included the likes of notable screenwriters, film producers, and directors. Starting with Adam Scott, producer and screenwriter, he wrote for the films Keeping Company in 1940, We Go Fast in 1941, The Parson of Panamint in 1941, and his biggest hit, 1943's Mr. Lucky. There was also Albert Maltz, a novelist, playwright, a short story writer, and a screenplay writer. He's had his films distributed to the military, who gave them notoriety and also screened some of his films. Alva Bessie, a member of the International Brigades, and fought in the Spanish Civil War and World War II. He wrote novels about his time in the war and was contracted by Warner Bros. To write movies for them. One movie he made independently was notably Hollywood on Trial, which was nominated for an Academy Award in the category of Best Documentary Feature. Dalton Trumbo, a novelist and screenwriter, ended up writing for films under a pseudonym after his blacklistings. He even ended up winning 2 Academy Awards under this name. In the 1960s, his films, Exodus and Spartacus, were the first films he was credited with after the Hollywood blacklistings. This is usually marked as the time that Trumbo and other screenwriters were taken off the blacklist. At this time, the Writers Guild of America recognized all his achievements, which ended up covering over 6 decades of work. Edward Dmytryk was one of the only people in Hollywood 10 who primarily directed. He's most well known for 1954's The Caine Mutiny, but did over 50 other movies. Herbert Biberman, one of the only other directors, was best known for his plays and his films. He was also a member of the Directors Guild of America, which had the main purpose of organizing individual professions instead of having multiple occupations across the film landscape. He had been expelled from the Directors Guild of America in 1950, but later rejoined in 1997. John Howard Lawson was another very popular screenwriter and playwright. After his return from prison, he moved to Mexico where he wrote several books and a screenplay for 1951's Cry, the Beloved Country, under a pseudonym like Dalton Trumbo. His last screenplay was 1957's The Careless Years, which was also made under a pseudonym. Lester Cole was a founding member of the Screenwriters Guild. It was an organization that attempted to create criteria for contributions to any film made under the screen credits. Ring Lardner Jr. was the son of Ring Lardner Sr., who had his work admired by some of the greatest known American writers of all time, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, with a relationship that has often cited to have enriched American literature. Though Ring Lardner Sr. wasn't a part of the Hollywood 10, his son, who was more focused in screenplay writing, was. Ring Lardner Jr. wrote over 30 films in his lifetime, and has received an Academy Award for his efforts. Samuel Orneitz, a scholar, novelist, and screenplay writer, helped to write the 1932 film Secrets of the French Police and the 1934 film One Exciting Adventure. All of these people combined helped establish what we know today as the Hollywood 10. Though there was no shortage of people that were blacklisted during this time, these 10, over the hundreds of other popular actors, directors, writers, and producers, take recognition as the most influential of this time period and stand out in the case against McCarthyism. Every one of the Hollywood 10 were sent to prison because of their acts. But why? Why wouldn't these well-respected, award-winning men just say they were not members of the Communist Party? Well, let's have them answer for us.
These investigations are actually traps. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's a form of legal lynching.
These men were only standing up for what they believed in. They were advocating for the freedom of expression and the right to deny something that they didn't believe in. If the Hollywood 10 never existed, who knows how the media landscape would look today? If their blacklistings were to have been left unopposed, the government may not have stopped there. But what happens if it goes beyond the film industry? Would our rights be held up in the same standards? This is what these men stood up for. They wouldn't let the government boss them around. Whether they were communist or not, that wasn't the point. In 1947, the Screen Actors Guild president, Ronald Reagan, even spoke out against the members who he believed to be a part of the Communist Party. He would later go on to become the 40th president of the United States. So let this be a message to anyone out there. Whether you have the future president advocating against you, or it feels like the entire world, just remember to stand up for what you believe in. And next time you see a communist spy trope in a movie or TV show, just remember why they were there to begin with. And with that said, thanks for watching.
Steam claims.
You're only getting half the picture. Call your cable company for your local cable hookup. Right now, though, we just keep the videos rolling on the music video channel that gives meaning to your boring, miserable life, Al TV.
You're watching Al TV, the video music channel that helps drown out all those voices inside your head.
Beavis and Butthead. This satirical commentary on teenage life helped to shape the decade and pave the way for these two boys to enter the mainstream. Since the early 2000s, MTV has transitioned over to lower-effort reality shows and has yet to focus once again on more narrative content. With the internet becoming more and more prevalent as time went on, it showed that there was less and less of a reason to play music videos on the channel, as it was now readily available at your fingertips through YouTube. In 2011, Beavis and Butthead did come back But with the number of changes that have happened to MTV, Beavis and Butthead's resurgence was not met with the same success that it had had in its glory days. But why was this? And how did it go on to create such a large footprint in entertainment and the world around us? In this episode of Film History Digest, we'll go over how these two young devils went from pulling pranks and commenting on music videos to shaping the media landscape, and how we consume the content we do today. Let's begin. The start of Beavis and Butthead goes all the way back to before the beginning of MTV and Viacom. Mike Judge, the show's creator, has been known to be one of those rare people who've gone on to have the same success in live action as in animation. He's gone on to find his great success with Fox's King of the Hill, which ran for 12 seasons, his Emmy Award-winning live-action HBO show, Silicon Valley, and a few other movies, all of which have experienced a varying amount of success, with Office Space being his largest standout. With a degree in physics, Mike Judge didn't have much experience in animation. For the first Beavis and Butthead animations, they were completed by Judge independently. Being mostly self-taught, this animation was not of the most professional caliber. At the time, animation was still synonymous with children's entertainment, and the animation department at MTV was nothing more than an overlap that they had with Nickelodeon, being owned by the same parent company. With the introduction of video jockeys, where they had personalities introduce music videos or bands that you've never heard of before, they began to open the door to using the format in a more creative way. With Al TV, we saw Weird Al Yankovic use his trademark absurdist humor that he often uses in his own music to introduce other songs played by the TV station, while also poking fun in his MTV News parody segments. With Beavis and Butthead, the point of the show was to do the same. Instead of simply introducing the videos, they would just talk over them within the context of the episode itself. Most of the time, the episode wouldn't narratively connect to the music videos, but they had always been in the context of these two young high schoolers screwing around and watching music videos. For the time, seeing an honest interpretation of how teenagers act was something that was not seen very much on television. Before this, the only show that displayed the bratty side of the American family was The Simpsons. Beavis and Butthead's dumbed-down satirical humor acted as a commentary on culture and the schooling system in America. With all this, it's understandable how people could view these characters, and the show respectively, as dumbing down the country.
What's that noise?
I got a better idea. Let's take a Winston break. That's it. Winston is the one filter cigarette that delivers flavor 20 times a pack. Winston's got that filter blend. Yeah, Fred.
Early Hanna-Barbera cartoons, like the Flintstones, are usually what's considered to be the first animation aimed towards a more adult crowd. While the show is commonly associated with children's animation, the intention of the show is actually to be viewed by all audiences. That's why the characters in the Flintstones used to sell Winston cigarettes on old commercials. While some of this adult animation was done by Hanna-Barbera, arguably the most influential to come out was not from them, but instead Fox. This show would go on to be the most successful adult cartoon of all time and popularize the idea as a whole. This show was known as The Simpsons, which popularized it. Being one of the biggest and longest running TV shows, you can tell that the show is what a large portion of adult animation has been inspired by, especially Beavis and Butthead. With The Simpsons' initial crude animation as shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show, it had already proven that audiences enjoyed the clever comedy and subversiveness of The Simpsons, which is why it reached the amount of success it has. While The Simpsons is quite tame in today's standards, the antics shown by Homer and Bart's utter stupidity did not help the show to shed its stigma of being unintelligent television.
Trying to strengthen the American family to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like The Simpsons. Huh?
Hey, we're just like the Waltons. We're praying for an end to the Depression, too.
With the popularity of The Simpsons, seeing the show mentioned by America's president at the time, it really showed how far the show's reputation had gone. This helped to clarify how much untapped potential there was in the marketplace for subversive content on television as it entered the mainstream. This left enough untapped potential for Beavis and Butthead to come in and provide audiences with more options to get their fix of more abrasive and offensive humor.
This is Liquid Television.
I know you're gonna dig this.
I'm gonna set the building on fire.
With the first public incarnation of Beavis and Butthead, they appeared on MTV's first animated TV show, Liquid Television, which was an animated variety showcase intended for mature audiences. The segment Frog Baseball was the first look audiences had of Beavis and Butthead. In this early, undeveloped rendition of the characters, enough interest was sparked that MTV gave them their own standalone program. Liquid Television was also notable for being the start of Aeon Flux and a few other shorts like Office Space, which Mike Judge also made and later adapted into a live-action feature film. Straight out of the gate, Beavis and Butthead were slammed by parental figure groups for its themes of violence, crude humor, and easily interpretable actions. In 1993, only 7 months into the series' lifespan, it was hit with a large amount of scrutiny when a 5-year-old boy ended up setting his mobile home on fire, causing the death of his infant sister.
Last week, this Ohio blaze left 2-year-old Jessica Matthews dead. The fire was started by her 5-year-old brother, whom the mother says is a Beavis and Butthead fan. The mother blamed the tragedy on the influence of MTV's 2 animated Bad Boys.
He was obsessed with Beavis and Butthead. Every time that he watched them, he would try to mimic what they'd done to the point where he started playing with matches in the lights.
MTV was faced with a lot of controversy after this incident, as it wasn't the only time something like this had happened.
Beavis had a lighter and Butthead had an aerosol can, and they did it in school and they blew Butthead's head off. Beavis.
The girls tried it at home, and this is what happened. Their mother, Crystal, who told them not to watch the show, was distraught and angry.
I blame the show Beavis and Butthead on this because my kids said they got it off of Beavis and Butthead. My kids have never played with matches or lighters. I teach them that. The school teaches them that.
MTV's official response was, "We're not aware of all the facts, but obviously this event was a terrible tragedy," also noting that responsible programming on MTV has always been and will continue to be our top priority. The issue with these controversies were the fine details, however, when you realize some of the instances were stirred up for publicity.
I have talked to Austin Messner, the kid who set the fire in Moraine, Ohio. Became friends with him over the years, honestly. And it's funny because I found him on Facebook. I sent him a message, and he replied back to me a year to the date. Wow. And literally told me, like, more or less, fuck you, go talk to my mom, she's into this type of shit. And I explained, like, no, dude, I'm just, like, I'm the same age as you, I'm a nerd, and, you know, I just always kind of wondered what happened to you, what really happened and whatnot. And then he kind of just opened up and told me the whole story about how he had never seen the show, that his mom called the news before she called the fire department that day. Yeah. And that's why in all that news footage, sorry, I have a train going on in the background, I don't know if you can hear that. That's why in all that news footage, suspiciously, like, the fire squad is just getting there to put it out and all that footage. I always wondered about that, you know?
In the number of years after Beavis and Butthead were on the air, there has been several studies about the potential link of reenacting violence seen in media, with violent video games being at the center of the discussion. The vast majority of studies have found that the correlation between shows like Beavis and Butthead and violence is minimal, if not non-existent. While there are many different causes and reasons why someone would commit a violent act, the evidence has repeatedly shown that movies and media are not one of them. To show elsewise represents that empathy is learned and not inherited. While this may have been what studies have shown now, the amount of time and effort spent on these studies have only been sparked by more modern events. With the influx of school shootings and the Columbine High School massacre, which touted the film Natural Born Killers, and certain computer games like Doom and Duke Nukem 3D as their inspiration for their horrendous acts. Before tragedies like these, the general populace didn't see a need for these sort of studies. Someone in California even used their lottery winnings to start up a hotline to get the show canceled, along with several other advocacy groups going out of their way to try and get the show off the air. With Beavis and Butthead's almost immediate success, MTV was hesitant to change the placement of the show or cancel it since the show was already doing so well. While it's fair to mention that there were a large number of people who called for the cancellation of Beavis and Butthead, the positive feedback largely silenced the echo chamber created by these groups going against the show.
I don't think people who weren't there understand how big of a deal this was. I mean, it was unavoidable on the news. I was in school at that time. I remember wearing a shirt and being brought into the principal's office, and the principal obviously had not seen the show, being like, you know, they kill animals, they set cats on fire and all this. And my
it's funny to think how, like
revolutionary Beavis and Butthead were when they first started. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
I guess. Not this video game,
No, the cartoon.
Oh, okay.
Like, no one had ever seen anything like that. I guess.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
To show how successful Beavis and Butthead really was for MTV when it first aired, it ended up doubling the ratings for its time slot. After the incident where the little boy set his home on fire, it was able to stir up so much national attention it started to tarnish the reputation of MTV and Viacom. MTV's official response to the controversy was to deny responsibility for these actions, as mentioned before. Even though Mike Judge suggested that they change the show's time slot, MTV didn't change it until after a bit more media scrutiny. They then decided to remove any references to fire in the show, while also removing the episode which was cited to have caused the tragedy from further syndication. Around the same time, the program was facing heat for something similar. The movie was targeted towards high school football players, and had a scene where the students essentially try to play chicken by laying in the road. While the program wasn't made by any of the same people that worked on Beavis and Butthead, the film hit controversy around the same time as the Beavis and Butthead incident. The way they course-corrected was very similar as well. With the program, the studio who made the film, Touchstone Pictures, ended up sending out a new version of the film with the scene removed. While this helped to deal with the controversy, it created a new climate where it was now possible for film companies to retroactively change their films, even after having been put into cinemas. Since this was done almost 30 years ago, they had to physically send out new versions of the film to theaters. While pivoting like this was very costly for the time, it's worth noting that looking back, there have been a lot more cases of films being updated after they've already been released. Since then, movie theaters have changed their delivery systems, so all they have to do is essentially stream their films rather than projecting it. So now, since these movies are more streamlined, these films can get an update after they've already been released to fix issues retroactively, like what happened recently with the adaptation of Cats. Since movie studios know that they can change movies even after they've already been screened theatrically, it could be argued that it led towards more lazy filmmaking, which was all stemmed from what happened to the program and Beavis and Butthead. With Beavis and Butthead, there's a bit of a difference between how it was changed while compared to the program. Since they did not have to widely deliver new versions of Beavis and Butthead to theaters, this was mostly just a temporary solution in order to calm the increase in backlash that the show was getting. Since Beavis' catchphrase was him yelling fire, this led towards the writers on the show having to work around this, leading them towards really treading the line in future episodes by saying words close to the word fire.
Fryer! Fryer! Fryer!
After a bit more criticism, MTV finally ended up moving the air date of the show, which finally made the majority of the criticism calm down.
Goodbye, you guys.
In fact, I've even thought the South Park movie from '99 was kind of about the Beavis and Butthead controversy, where the kids go and see the Terrence and Phillip movie. Kenny dies from lighting his fart on fire, and then the parents not wanting to blame themselves, so we go to war with Canada. So I feel like that movie was like a full circle on the '90s animation controversy. In fact, it's my favorite movie of all time for that reason.
Right.
The fallout of this situation is something that's often overlooked. While the writers of Beavis and Butthead were later able to use references to fire when the show got renewed for an 8th season in 2011, this incident ended up changing a lot of Viacom's policies and how fire was shown through the rest of their shows. One of the biggest changes Viacom made was to the pilot of Jackass, which had the omission of Steve-O's first stunt in the series. Since nobody knew how much of a success Jackass would be, it was not given much attention for the time being. Steve-O wrote about this in his memoir, where he describes the situation a bit further. Another scene that Viacom cut was from SpongeBob SquarePants, where they set Squidward on fire while he was attempting to sneak back into the Krusty Krab. While Viacom has never come out with an official statement, it is believed that it was either cut due to the Beavis and Butthead situation, or it was because it was aired after the recent 9/11 attacks. One of the other scenes cut by Viacom's new policies were from an early episode of South Park. During the uncut version of the episode, Stan's sister is seen repeatedly setting him on fire. Since Comedy Central is owned by Viacom, the creators have admitted that it was their intervention that caused the scene's removal. During reruns of the episode, you can see a puddle underneath Stan, and for a long time people didn't know why it was there. MTV was also slowly pivoting away from music videos over to reality TV and other types of low-effort content. While this was not completely instigated by the Beavis and Butthead incident, it became more and more clear that the channel was not the same place after that. Even though the show was relatively easy to produce and the majority of the airtime was taken up with voiceover and reused animation, it was still shown to not be worth continuing by the creator, who admitted burnout. After MTV changed to reality television and Viacom's adult animation transitioning over to Comedy Central, Beavis and Butthead leaving helped to pave the way for reality television to change the state of television forever. After a great run and a feature-length film, the show ended up going down as one of the greats. The movie ended up breaking box office records and gained critical acclaim. Renowned film reviewer Roger Ebert ended up saying this about the movie: "It would be easy to attack Beavis and Butthead as ignorant, vulgar, depraved, repulsive slobs. Of course they are. But that would miss the point, which is that Mike Judge's characters reflect parts of the society that produced them. To study Beavis and Butthead is to learn about a culture of narcissism, alienation, functional illiteracy, instant gratification, and television zombiehood. Those who deplore Beavis and Butthead are confusing the messengers with the message." With the newfound general recognition of this series, it seemed like the right time to end the show. With the impact the show had on inadvertently exposing people to the depraved youth, Viacom's change of policy with its future shows, and the effect of future censorship through the years, it really does display the impact these two boys have had over the last 30 years. So when people say Beavis and Butthead doubled down, America, let's hope that they're right.
Okay, let's get this out of the way. The Room is not the worst movie ever, not by a long shot. While you can easily tear apart films like The Room for their overtly noticeable audio dubbing, strange and somewhat comical dialogue, the nonsensical story direction, or just the overall performances in the film, at the same time, these are all the reasons that people love it. For a movie like The Room, it takes a level of blissful ignorance to create something that could be enjoyed by so many for all of the wrong reasons, and be embraced with all the attention it has. But it takes a special type of film to defy all odds and have no redeemable quality. In this episode of Film History Digests, we'll be going over what makes the worst movie ever made, and what that really means in the grand scheme of things. Now, while going over what makes a bad movie bad, and what that means in comparison to some of the greatest movies ever made, it all comes down to how we objectively value films. With the worst film ever made, the idea of what constitutes that quality is more based on the inability of the people in charge of the product. That's why you constantly see films like The Room, Birdemic, Troll 2, and Food Fight at the top of the lists for the worst films ever made. With The Room, the story around the film is arguably more important than the film itself. The reason why people enjoy hating The Room so much is because of how strange it is, and wondering how it could make it through all the steps of the filmmaking process. With Tommy Wiseau, a director who was relatively unknown for the time, he was able to put up a billboard advertising his film in one of the most active parts of Los Angeles. With Tommy Wiseau being a very oddball character, and the movie's exceedingly strange and somewhat humorous content, seeing this movie would make people wonder about the person behind the film. It is strange to wonder how he managed to procure enough money to keep the billboard up for as long as he did, let alone fund the production of the film. Since there was very little known about Tommy Wiseau's nationality, finances, and just the overall production of the film, it leaves a mysterious aura around The Room, which was intriguing enough to give the film the reputation it has today. With the retroactive fame the movie's gotten, with Greg Sestero and Tom Bissell's book on the making of the film, James Franco's biopic, and the documentaries made on it, it shows the cultural relevance of this film as it enters the general filmgoer's psyche. However, for a film like The Room to make as large of an impact as it has, it is somewhat unfair to call it the worst movie ever made. While from a technical standpoint, there are a lot more movies that have failed far more spectacularly than The Room has, you can tell, despite the sheer amount of incompetence in the film, there were a lot of people who really put their all into it. With the mass cult following of the film and the utter love it's gotten, to call this movie the worst film ever made is a disservice to the people who spent their time enjoying it for all of the wrong reasons. While The Room may have been a bad movie, there is enough good about the movie to justify the film's cult following. With the passion put behind the film, it is quite sustainable for the film to have received the attention it has. Even though it's widely believed to have been unintentional, the film's reputation as a black comedy has been what it will be recognized for, rather than the actual quality of the film. When it comes to The Room, you can get a lot worse than this movie. A lot worse. Going past The Room, you have to hit a level of sheer incompetence that just leaves the audience member in a perpetual state of awe. One of the most jaw-dropping examples of a bad film is After Last Season, which was made in possibly the most incompetent way imaginable. With shallow acting, atrocious music, poorly framed shots, horrible special effects, and a nonsensical storyline, it could be considered one of the worst movies ever made. While you can make a strong case against the film, the fact that you can marvel at the sheer incompetence on display is still a positive factor of the viewing experience. While technically speaking, After Last Season could be the worst movie, hitting the bottom of the barrel should mean finding a film that has no positive merits whatsoever, even in the so bad it's good way. The worst movie ever made should leave you with nothing gained from the experience whatsoever, and be a slog to get through. The issue with this idea is that a movie like that is less interesting to talk about than The Room and After Last Season's out there. While looking for a terrible movie with no discernible positive qualities to it, the worst criticism you can make for a truly awful movie is that it was just boring. When you criticize filmmaking, if all you can say about something is that it was boring, then you wouldn't bring much attention to it. So when you watch a movie like After Last Season or The Room and laugh at it or bring friends over, it keeps your attention, and you leave the film having gained a truly great experience from it. While it generally takes a large deal of effort and a devoted director behind a movie to release a finished film, for those movies that take no effort and come from the greed of corporate Hollywood, those are the really bad movies. The films that inflate their budget so far and flop so hard, those are the types of movies that deserve the title of the worst movie ever made. While films like Jack and Jill might be painful to watch and fall under the same circumstances, it's clear that it was the movie they were trying to go for. By definition, the movie Jack and Jill was made to be so bad it's good, which automatically makes it, sadly enough, enjoyable to some people. The movies that trade hands so often that the end product is indistinguishable from the initial intent, the movies that go through the system so much and lose any creative integrity that they may have had, are the real worst movies ever made. The films that are so creatively bankrupt, they're an insult to the medium as a whole. This is most often shown with films that take a well-beloved franchise or characters and make it just another entry into its respective series. When the title of the movie is lost and the film just becomes another product, it loses its artistic integrity. To become just another drop in the vast sea of Hollywood output, where you get tricked into watching something where the first intention was not to make a well-made movie, but you're tricked into paying for it anyway. That's why films like Solo, A Star Wars Story flopped as hard as they did, and films like Suicide Squad are so technically flawed, yet constitute another one of those so bad it's good films. While Solo is just another Star Wars film, Suicide Squad was able to amass a somewhat faithful following by the emo crowd, even being enough for them to make a sequel and earn an Oscar. This becomes ever more insulting when it devalues the series it came from, and ends up tainting the reputation of the originals. With the unending studio intervention, it shows that a computer and focus groups cannot make a quality movie. It takes risks and creativity in order to make a movie which resonates with its audience, like the original Star Wars did back in 1977. The backlash on The Last Jedi shows what happens when you try to take too many risks and end up alienating your audience. For companies like Disney, they look at statistics like this and try to figure out what went wrong. When companies do this, they try to course correct as much as possible, creating movies that are as unbalanced as The Rise of Skywalker, or in a different sense, The Last Jedi when they received criticism about The Force Awakens being too reminiscent of A New Hope. When creating a new film in a franchise, you have to toe the line between risking too much and not risking enough. That's why we've seen such a large hiatus on Disney's future Lucasfilm projects after the release of The Rise of Skywalker. While Sony ends up getting most of the flack in the film industry for being the most meddling film studio, it's mainly due to its attention towards larger franchises and not letting their directors fulfill their creative duties. Disney, on the other hand, is a cultural powerhouse, and the creative chokehold Disney has over our world's entertainment is unprecedented. Sony's logo is just their name, while Disney largely attributes its logo with Mickey Mouse and keeps a large relation of the brand with its franchises. For them to meddle, it's keeping in line with the outlook of the company rather than to create the best possible outcome. Inadvertently, the output of Disney films represent not only the studio's kid-friendly image, but the image portrayed by Mickey Mouse himself. So, with the studio assets growing more and more, it actually hinders their creative potential. While looking at Sony, studio meddling at all, it has put out some of the best films in the last decade. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was a milestone in technical innovation, with its continual development of 2D and 3D animation techniques. The Social Network is well revered as one of the most well-received films of all time. So, to compare these films to the likes of The Emoji Movie, the 2016 Ghostbusters, The Dark Tower, or any of Adam Sandler's endless troves of schlock, you can see where the criticism comes from. While there are some truly awful films made at Sony, when compared to the likes of Disney, you begin to realize how they've still yet to gain a grasp on creativity in any truly self-resonating films, outside of the studios they've acquired. The best received Disney movies during the last decade have been made by Pixar or Marvel. While critically and financially good investments, the idea of mainstream theatrical film experiences have leaned more towards this homogenization of types of movies that have found success. That's why we've seen so many directors like Martin Scorsese and David Fincher move over to the Netflix production pipeline. While looking at Disney's most critically acclaimed films of the last decade, nothing even comes close to what Sony has put out in terms of pure spectacle. So, while looking at the worst movie ever made, instead of focusing on what you might see as a technical disaster, be more careful about the type of content you get excited for just to be let down in all the worst ways. And while it's still possible that there's no correlation between certain movies, studios, and the quality of movies that they make, it may be worth changing who we blame for the faults of some of those movies. So when we laugh at the Rooms and the Trolls 2s out there, we can still live in solace knowing that the same treatment was not done to one of our favorite film franchises. And for the solos out there, the best we can do as an audience member is show Disney that we would not flock towards the same representative stale movie just because it has a character we recognize. In the end, we want to be shown the power of film. Whether it's using characters we've loved over the decades or a completely new franchise, creativity and innovation will always be the driving force behind what makes a film truly excellent.
For the general moviegoer, films that are given the generic identity of a war movie is disingenuous towards the horrors of life as a soldier overseas. While there has been countless different war movies over the years, one of the most prevalent war films of the last decade was Sam Mendes' 1917. With the heavy amount of work that went into 1917, and the film being shot to look like one take, it's easy to write this film off as simply just being Oscar bait, even though this really is not the case. Today, on this episode of Film History Digests, we will be looking under the hood of 1917 to see what hides beneath it. Let's begin. The story of 1917's development goes back to the director's first film, American Beauty, in 1999. While tonally different when compared to 1917, this was Sam Mendes' first directorial debut for a major motion picture, which helped him to hit the ground running in the world of filmmaking. Despite the fact that Mendes has more experience working in theater production, this film went to prove out of the gate the immense amount of talent Sam Mendes had, which was assured by the subsequent accolades of the film. Not many directors are able to secure an Academy Award nomination with their directorial debut, but Sam Mendes was able to not only get nominated, but win Best Picture and Best Director at the 72nd Academy Awards. The film also won 3 other awards for Best Acting, Screenplay, and Cinematography. It was also nominated with Best Actress, Best Score, and Best Film Editing. As Sam Mendes has stated previously, he has felt that his films have built off themselves and help him to create his next projects. With that mindset, it is good to look back at the movie that started it all and see where he's gone from here. The most notable attribute Sam Mendes has taken away from his work on American Beauty was his new partnership with the studio DreamWorks, who helped him with the production of a number of his other films, including 1917. It was also the first movie that Sam Mendes worked on with Thomas Newman, who would do the score for most of Mendes' future films. The movie, American Beauty, has had a large impact on pop culture as well, even being satirized in television and other forms of media.
It's like there's this incredibly benevolent force that wants me to know there's no reason to be afraid. Sometimes there's so much beauty in the world it makes my heart burst.
It's just some trash blowing in the wind. Do you have any idea how complicated your circulatory system is?
I'm sorry, Jake, but we met over spring break.
I'm not ordinary.
You're leaving me for this guy?
His name is Les, and he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And so is his bag.
Although the movie was highly regarded at the time, the themes of American Beauty have not aged well in retrospect, with the plot consisting of Kevin Spacey's character attempting to seduce a high school virgin, along with various other sexual escapades. With the allegations against Kevin Spacey since the film's release, and the movie's overt misogynistic and sexualized theming of young women, which was contentious for the film even at the time, it can be understood why people would rather not be associated with this film anymore. With one of Sam Mendes' next films, Jarhead, it shows Sam attempting to get his feet wet in the dramatic war film scene. Jarhead focused on the more recent for the time Gulf War and followed more on the psychological events of war, rather than the brutality in which war would usually entail. This kept more in line with the Anthony Swofford memoir Jarhead, in which the movie was based on and named after. This was the main reason why 1917 differed so much from Jarhead, since the narratives were constructed so differently. With Jarhead, it was meant to encapsulate the idea of marine life, and how even seeing no carnage could disrupt a man's mental psyche. In 1917, the story was more objective-based, and had a more linear construction towards the narrative structure. While this was mainly tied towards the one-shot structure of 1917, it also showed the bleak difference each war brought along with it. Since 1917 was also the first movie Sam Mendes worked on as a writer, it helped to lend itself towards how the two movies feel so different, even with some of the same crew members returning to work on 1917. Jarhead was also the first film that had Sam Mendes work with cinematographer Roger Deakins, who would later go on to win his second Academy Award for his efforts in 1917, with Deakins' first Oscar win being Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049, only 2 years earlier. With the wide scope and glorious vistas shown in Blade Runner 2049, you know you're in for a treat. Even though Jarhead and 1917 are two very different films, they both feel as if they were able to work off of each other in a similar sense to what Mendes mentioned before. Since war stories were such a large part of Mendes' life, with his grandfather's involvement in World War I, it is fair to assume that it helped inspire his willingness to be involved with Jarhead, as it did on a larger scale with 1917. For the work that Sam Mendes made after that, he usually points to his Bond films, which is what is usually cited as his biggest learning experience in terms of filmmaking and working with large action set pieces. Mendes has since said that working on the opening shot of Spectre is what first put the seeds in his mind to try and make 1917 all one shot. With Skyfall, you can see a few scenes which shows off Sam Mendes' talent for directing unnerving scenes and psychological horror. A notable scene which showcases this was when Raul Silva, portrayed by Javier Bardem in the film, removes his teeth in order to antagonize M. You really feel a sense of dread and horror that really none of Mendes' previous films, nor the other Bond films, had yet to accomplish. With his villain's intent and overall on-screen presence, it's not hard to understand why he's at the top of the list for some of the best Bond villains. There's a reason they casted one of the main actors from No Country for Old Men to play this role.
Will you hold still, please?
And since his acting was always so menacing in that film, it lended him perfectly to play one of the most menacing Bond villains of all time. In No Country for Old Men, when you hear him speak, it alone helps you to understand what he's capable of.
Call it. Call it, yes. For what? Just call it. Well, we need to know what we're calling it for here.
You need to call it. I can't call it for you.
Hydrogen cyanide?
Just watching this scene over and over again, you can get a complete sense of who this character is and how twisted his mind frame has gotten. From the quietness of the shot to the actor's performance and his maniacal laugh, you really start to feel a lot of the same types of stress and horror that Mendes would later use in 1917. With Sam Mendes coming off the heels of Spectre, and Roger Deakins coming off his first Academy Award win with Blade Runner 2049, who would have guessed that the next film they would work on together would have been such a dramatic difference in terms of creativity? With 1917, this was the first time Sam Mendes had his hand in the scriptwriting process for one of his films. He worked on it with Scottish screenwriter Christy Wilson Cairns, who also had her hand in the Showtime horror drama Penny Dreadful, which Mendes was an executive producer for. Christy Wilson Cairns is also working with Edgar Wright on his horror movie Last Night in Soho, so her talent for horror writing is clearly what helped make 1917 so frightening in the long run. While the writing is unique and even Academy Award nominated, anyone who's seen the movie knows that it is nowhere near the best aspect of the film.
Screenplay. What an odd choice for screenplay. 1917. What an odd choice. I don't even think it's terrible, but screenplay? No. Come on.
With 1917, the film really shines from the directing. With another Academy Award nomination, the directing in 1917 is outright poetic. For someone like Sam Mendes to play with your emotions the way he does, it is so apparent that if this movie did not come out between such stiff competition at the Academy Awards, that it might have won him his second Academy Award for Best Directing. With the way that this film is shot, the pacing, the blocking, and even the outstanding action choreography, it goes to show the amount of commitment Mendes had to making this the best possible story he could. While not based on any real events, it was loosely based around the stories that Sam Mendes heard from his grandfather, other World War I veterans, and history museums in order to make sure that this story was portrayed as authentic as possible. With all the challenges and attention to detail this movie had, it's another testament to how well this movie transports you into the world it created. When you get sucked into this world with the depth and realism, the horror hits you even harder, especially since it starts out mildly tame. When the film opens, we're first shown a field of flowers, symbolically juxtaposing this beauty with what the film is going to later throw at us. As we follow the main characters, they get deeper into the trenches before they're met with the main inciting incident in the film. As they start to traverse through the trenches, the scene begins to get darker and darker, setting the tone of what is to come. When they get their orders, they travel into much darker scenery, which is indicative of the events which are yet to take place, foreshadowing what is to come. This induces a feeling of anxiety, and as an audience member, we subliminally understand that something bad is about to happen. During this scene, we learn of the plan which mirrors the real-life events of Operation Alberich, which had the German forces retreat in order to ambush the French. In the movie, they learn about what is supposed to happen, and are ordered to traverse to no man's land across the German line. Their mission was to inform the other battalion to save them from sending out the soldiers for a battle they will not win, and as they will soon learn, this task is quite the undertaking. What raises the stake is the fact that Lance Corporal Blake, one of the main characters, has his brother in the other battalion which is about to be ambushed. This adds more tension as we have more of an understanding of where our main character's heart is. They end up climbing over their trenches and make their way on through no man's land. While the movie has stayed fairly tame to this point, the camera is made sure to stay close and isolated as to not show much of the view. At the start, it only shows the barbed fence, muddy puddles, and horses killed by the Germans in order to limit their transportation. We start seeing more dead bodies and how truly terrible the situation is for our main characters. We see Schofield get his hand cut open by old barbed wire on the broken fence, and even seeing that small injury he received goes a long way to captivate us in a deep sense of relatability. This shows that the characters are not invincible, which helps for the audience to recognize that the consequences are even higher than they may realize. Something that Sam Mendes is great at as a director, and something that is well shown throughout the film, is the building of stress and subliminal thought that is more common with horror films and psychological horror directors like Stanley Kubrick. While a good number of people are not able to relate with the violence in this movie, we can all relate to getting cuts in our hands. So seeing something all the more relatable, all while directly following it up by him accidentally putting it into the decomposing chest of a dead person, it really makes you wonder about the real difficulties that these men had to go through, even though they were not based on any existing soldiers during the war. With the way this movie is shot, we never have a moment to breathe. The film keeps on going after this, and with no noticeable cut in order to keep with the anxiety of what happened, it makes it harder and harder to not get invested as a viewer from just this small moment alone. With everything that happens later on, he still has to deal with a hand that is riddled with bacteria, and with how it's shot, you keep that in mind more than a more traditional film. They keep on walking with little music playing until they finally make it to another break in the wire. It is then that we are able to see how terrible and disgusting this place really is, as we are shown the pit they have to cross, with dead bodies floating in the disgusting rainwater. We notice how unfazed Blake and Schofield are by this, and it shows how desensitized they have been, implying that the length of time they must have spent already fighting in this war is much longer than what we see on screen. Their mission is to deliver this message, and nothing will stop them. When they are walking along the side of this giant pit, this is the first part of the movie where we're introduced to the menacing power of the score. While the movie had a bit of music at the beginning, this is the part where you start to feel it more as another character in the story. The somber, creeping nature of it, a sad song playing slowly as it ramps up more and more as Blake and Schofield make it to the German lines. It keeps getting louder and more aggressive right up until they get to the trenches and they aim their guns out at nothing. The score stops, and due to the amazing filmmaking, it makes it so that we were so invested that we didn't even notice. It was not until then that Schofield finally had time to clean his hand by pouring a bit of his drinking water over it and covering it with a few bandages. While it turns out that there are not any Germans in the trenches, Blake and Schofield are still vigilant and focused on finishing their mission. It was not until then that Schofield finally had time to clean his hand by pouring a bit of his drinking water over it and covering it with a few bandages. They then find a bucket of ash, still hot, showing that there were enemy forces there not too long ago, raising the tension more and more. They continue to follow along the trenches, eventually finding a bunker filled with cots and food left there in a hurry by the Germans. With bags of food tied up on the wall and more rats showing up, Blake and Schofield become ever more curious about the state of these corridors. They are looking around until Schofield stops in his tracks and points something out.
Goes from here to the door. Oh, Jesus! Oh, no!
At that moment, being met by the stark sound of a loud explosion would really startle anyone watching this for the first time. In consideration of the investment you have had in the film up to this point, being so scared and startled by this scene helps to pull you in closer to the action. Due to the way that this was shot, we're led to believe that they were not going to set off the booby trap, and as the rat falls on the ground, we're left to catch our breaths before it sets off the explosives. This is the first major release of tension in the film, and even before you have time to recover, you're hit by the giant explosion, literally and figuratively. And with all this, they still have to keep going. There's still an hour left of this movie, and there's barely any time to breathe. This is one of those rare moments where the jump scare is not the part that scares people, but the moments following it. That is the making of a good horror film. While many people don't enjoy cheap jump scares in movies, this was the perfect way to build up a successful jump scare, only because it really meant something. At home, this experience was one of those that was not as fulfilling in the cinema, due to the excellent sound mixing by Mark Taylor and Stuart Wilson. With all that said, however, the effectiveness of this scene is a testament to the work of Mark Taylor and Stuart Wilson, even when sized down to a home setup. With the scene in particular, the sound mixing really goes to show how to jar your emotions. The way this shot was composed, you already know that the rat was going to set off the wire, but you don't have enough time to mentally prepare before the large release of tension. This was then followed by Blake and Schofield leaving the caves at the same time Schofield had to make his way out of this already stressful situation, all while blinded by the ash that came down from the explosion. Schofield could have died if he was left there, as he was covered in rocks as the cave was collapsing. Blake makes his first priority to save Schofield, who would not have been able to make it out of the cave if he didn't get help from Blake. Schofield then has to rely on his friend to lead the way, while acting as his eyes. With the tension racing up, they have to find their way over a mine shaft, and Schofield has to jump over it blind and trust Blake in order to make it across, all the while fighting the clock to get out before it collapses. With your heart rate rising, your blood pumping, you don't even have time to realize you just got scared as you wait in suspense to see what happens next so you can eventually put your guard back down. Any movie that can create that much atmosphere and can scare the people watching it like this movie just did deserves to be classified as a horror flick. If you don't have enough time to breathe, if you can't think and are almost put into shock from what you're witnessing, that means the director has you right where he wants you. A true testament of great filmmaking. After that long series of events, you realize that there's still so much to go. A fault with the movie now is that you've been seeing what it has to offer. As you continue to watch, we see Blake and Schofield leave the corridors, showing us a glimpse of the field where the Germans fired off their artillery. At this point, they're debating if he should go back or not, and then they make the decision to keep on going after they catch their breath, as we as an audience do so additionally. As they continue on, they start to transition over from this barren wasteland over to a more greener, farm-like area where we're introduced to a different type of scenery for the first time in the whole movie, in a way juxtaposing the beginning with the shot that follows. This new scenery implies a sweeter or calm experience for our main characters, and puts you into another false sense of peacefulness before reaching possibly the most heartbreaking scene in the entire movie. This moment does not last long, as they end up coming across an old abandoned home. They're able to find a cow, which helps them stock up on milk. The positives at this point begin to end, as a dogfight in the distance ends up leading to one of the German planes crashing into the barn. After Blake and Schofield try to help the injured soldier, showing that he's badly wounded, Schofield goes off to get him some water to put out the fire, before he turns back around to see Blake stabbed, with his screams being heard off screen. Even though Schofield tries saving him, he bleeds out and ends up dying in his arms. The way he was stabbed and the lack of focus on the action leads towards a sense of shock and horror as we try to piece it together ourselves. As Schofield is forced to go on without him, it is heartbreaking that this person who just saved his life was not able to do the same. After Blake finally passes, a convoy drives by. If only they were just a moment earlier, they could have been able to help save him. The horrors of losing someone in the battle is something that weighed deeply on Schofield. The idea of this psychological horror right after a more physical type creates a somber tone that 1917 is able to pull off perfectly. When he's forced to move on, the score comes back into play as an active reminder of the brutality only hinted at earlier in the film. While this movie deals with darker subject matter, there's a great piece of advice that the captain tells Schofield after he just saw his friend murdered. It doesn't do well to dwell on it. Schofield ends up hitching a ride in the convoy, which conveniently is going the way he is. Unfortunately, they end up hitting a broken bridge. Since he's under a time crunch, he has to make the difficult decision to traverse the rest of the way without the convoy in order to make it on time. While he begins to traverse the bridge, Schofield starts to get shot at. He tries to go after the man who is shooting at him, and when he is finally able to, he shoots him while simultaneously getting shot himself. Luckily, this only knocks Schofield unconscious, but loses him a great deal of time. When he gets up, he notices it's dark out. But this is one of those amazing parts of the film where we see some of that incredible cinematography that Roger Deakins is known for. As lights shoot off in the sky, it illuminates Schofield's surroundings as he continues on. He then has to run through the maze of this fallen city and dodge enemy fire as he tries to find his way closer and closer to his destination. In a scene most reminiscent of Roger's work in Jarhead with the oil fires, this scene shows what it looks like deeper into the city as it's being burnt to the ground. Schofield ends up hiding in a building after he's shot at and runs into a woman with a child. And at this moment we realize that this is her horror. She thinks that Schofield is a German soldier, and in the scene following he has to convince her that he is not. She then reveals that she has a baby, one abandoned without food or water. Schofield ends up giving her all his food, but she says the baby can't eat any of it since it's so young. That's when the milk they got early on comes back into play. While the horrors of the scene are not very scary to the viewer, it represents the internal horrors she must have been facing. As she starts to trust him, she begins to help him with the head wound he obtained when he got shot at earlier. As he starts to get going, she begs for him to stay. She knows that the horrors out there are terrible enough for not only her to fear being alone, but for her being afraid about the troubles he's about to face. When Schofield leaves, he tries to stay cautious. He tries to get away before getting spotted by a German soldier who he ends up strangling to death. He almost gets stabbed. While the horrors are really only shown with their silhouettes, it displays how implied horror is sometimes more frightening than the event itself. Schofield then tries to run away while being shot at by a few other German soldiers, and he falls into the river trying so hard to escape. As he tries to swim to stay afloat, almost getting hit by rocks, Schofield puts his head under the water and he doesn't come up for a while. He then breathes a breath of air before he slowly goes under the water, hanging on the driftwood as he just floats there. His face is just as white and expressionless as Blake's before he died. Then the cherry petals start to fall. After the events Schofield had to deal with, this gives him the push to continue and the reminder of his fallen friend. This gets followed by another bleak reminder as he's struck by a dam of dead bodies he has to climb over. The feeling of the events that took place at this point makes Schofield start to cry out. This is one of the only times that we actually physically see how the events of his journey has affected him. With the river of bodies he had to climb, it shows just how disturbing everything is and how you're supposed to move past it with little detail. As he continues to walk, however, he finds who he's looking for in the woods. They're all listening to a man sing a song which mirrors the events of what he dealt with before, working as a thematic bookend to him finally arriving at his destination. As he sits down and listens to the man sing, he gives one more deathly expression, looking pale and unlively as possible. He then learns that this is one of the later waves, and he has to go to the front of the line where they're being attacked to find Colonel Mackenzie and get him to call off the attack. He keeps looking for Colonel Mackenzie, but soon realizes that he's running out of time. At this point, he ends up climbing the trench and starts running on the field while being blasted at. This moment purposely shows not only the scope, but how the horror of war makes something as powerful as this all the more frightening. There's a reason why this moment is used in all the promotional material, and it really is a testament to how powerful it is. At any moment he could have been blown to pieces, but he continues on to make sure he stopped the battle. What's even more impactful about this is the fact that this was part of one of the stories of what happened to Sam Mendes' grandfather. He's too late to stop the first wave, but he was able to make his way up towards Colonel Mackenzie, and then he's finally able to get him to help. After barely dodging these attacks, witnessing these people run towards their demise, the true terror of this scene was that Colonel Mackenzie does not believe Schofield. Once he reads his letter from Army Command, he calls off the attack. For Schofield, this was finally the end for him, but for Mackenzie, this is his horror. Because even though this attack was called off, the war is not over. They will continue on, and this was just prolonging the inevitable. The movie ends with Schofield reconnecting with Blake's brother at the triage station. We get to see our final bit of horror as we witness everyone with injuries getting medical assistance, another reminder of the horrors that took place. This was also a reminder that without Schofield, there would be a lot more people there. When he meets Blake's brother, we see just how distraught he is to have lost his brother. The final horrors of this movie. He then shakes Blake's brother's hand before once again laying back down at the tree. With the somber score accompanying the scene, we know for Schofield at least, the horror is over. For now, at least. With the synopsis of the film, you can see now how this is a horror movie rather than any other type of genre. While some scenes are more action-based and there are pieces of comedy sprinkled throughout, the film techniques used and the writing all lend itself to some of the best horror cinema out there. War is not a genre. It's something real that happened to us, and it's a big part of our history as a country and the world as a whole. The events in this movie are so horrific because it's all real. The attention of 1917 is all stuff that either could have happened or really did happen. When you jolt up with a racing heart at the large explosion in the cave, when you wince in pain when Schofield gets his hand stabbed by the barbed wire fence, when you see Schofield about to be slammed up against a rock in the current, when Colonel Mackenzie does not trust Schofield to call off these attacks. These are all aspects of this movie that are indirectly frightening. The horrors of war are not a genre itself, but what Sam Mendes was able to do with 1917 transcended the definition of a war film. You would never say that a movie like The Incredibles or Anomalisa were made in the genre of animation, and you can't say that The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is in the same genre as A Million Ways to Die in the West, just because they're both westerns. 1917 may be a war film, but in terms of the genre and feeling of this movie, 1917 is a horror movie. Thanks for watching.
When talking about the worst movies ever made, it's easier to define since what qualifies as a good movie is a lot less objective than what makes a bad one. While a film could be technically flawed, for a movie to succeed, it takes a lot more work to make something special. That's why directors like Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino are so well respected, with the ways they strive to innovate and how they've pioneered new filmmaking techniques. A good director always tries to make sure they don't waste our time. While the general moviegoer might not notice subtle changes found in more artistic films, these aspects are what really go to make up some of the more well-revered movies. With the prestige of the Academy Awards and the validation filmmakers crave, the nomination alone is celebrated year after year. The Academy always gets a fair amount of animosity thrown their way, as there's always debate towards what movies get snubbed from the awards.
Uncut Gems isn't nominated. I think it's pretty clear that the Academy hates the Safdie brothers at this point, and I don't really know why. A Best Actor nomination for Adam Sandler honestly would not feel out of place. Unfortunately, the Academy Award nominations are all just one big marketing game. These nominations are not really a reflection of the best films of the year. It is also a reflection of the amount of money spent in for-your consideration campaigns. And with A24 spending all of their money and efforts promoting Uncut Gems, it seems as though they forgot about other films like Waves. When I saw Waves, I truly thought that this would be Trey Edward Schultz's chance at the Oscars. It was incredible.
Whether it be Uncut Gems not getting a nomination, Citizen Kane losing Best Picture, or Alfred Hitchcock being nominated 5 times, but never winning once, the lack of recognition in the industry implies a notable indifference towards certain parts of the film industry that just don't fit the status quo set by the elite Hollywood insiders. With the amount of debate over what films should qualify for the awards, is it even fair to quantify something like that? There's also a large audience who viewed Oscar films as boring and pretentious. So whether the greatest movie is the Oscar-worthy epic that swept the show floor, the more grandiose theater-filling blockbuster, or even a smaller indie film that gets little recognition within the traditional Hollywood system, in this episode of Film History Digests, we'll be going over what constitutes remarkable filmmaking, and what could be considered the greatest movie ever made. For any casual moviegoer, avid moviegoer, or someone who's had to deal with a bit of small talk during a date, you've more than likely been asked, what is your favorite movie? For some people, this question's easy, but for others, it might be one of the hardest questions you can ask them. To ask something as biased as quantifying your enjoyment of a specific medium of entertainment is justly flawed within itself. Even with that understanding, award ceremonies have been trying to classify the objectivity of filmmaking for years now. Whether it's been the Academy Awards, the People's Choice Awards, the Independent Spirit Awards, Kids' Choice Awards, or the Golden Globes, these ceremonies have been shown to attempt and chronicle these movies as they release year to year, and show how they represent this faction of higher-level films. With all these award shows that try to quantify the best aspects of that year's film, the system is automatically flawed due to its year-to-year ranking. Even with this omission, these award shows have shown throughout time to have had other faults with their exclusion of legacy film content like Citizen Kane, which is regularly referred to as one of the most quintessential film experiences. Award shows have also limited the grasp on the higher grossing films, like when Star Wars: A New Hope lost its Best Picture win to Annie Hall. or Avengers Endgame's lack of any nomination outside of visual effects. How could these two films be any less than any other film? Star Wars was the highest grossing film for its time, and Avengers Endgame holds the current record. Considering Star Wars made more of a financial and innovative cultural impact than Annie Hall ever did, how did Annie Hall win over Star Wars? Even 40 years later, this has shown to still be the case. With the large success of Disney's first few Star Wars films, it's shown the large impact the series has made over people everywhere, with their general success even after the long wait since the previous films. As consumers, we pay with our wallets, and as consumers, we've shown what types of films we would want to see, and yet the Academy and certain other organizations rarely seem to recognize their achievements. When the first Academy Awards started in 1929, the main reason it was started was not out of artistic integrity, but as more of a way to secure extra money for the film industry. During this time, the Hays Code was still in place, severely limiting the creative output of directors and visionaries alike. This was a time where all movies were meant to conform to mostly the same narrative beats, plot structure, and squeaky clean subject matter. So, with all the changes that have happened, how can the best picture of then stand up to the best picture now? With the greatest film ever made, it's been shown that the way the Academy qualifies the movies is objectively flawed, as it values artistic merit and studio buyout over its larger appeal and audience reaction. While it is true that the Academy doesn't try to signify what the best film of all time is, it's still worth the mounting criticism towards them for underrepresenting what is culturally recognized to be so. While there have always been other awards to help bridge the gap into the mainstream, the prestige of the Oscars is always held in higher regard when compared to the rest. While there have always been other awards to help bridge the gap into the mainstream, the prestige of the Oscars is always held in higher regard when compared to the rest, just to leave out some of the most influential films ever made. There are so many other movies that do not get the recognition they deserve, and nobody even knows about them. Without Evil Dead or Freddy vs. Jason, we would not have the Marvel Cinematic Universe in its current form. The Academy has been historically distant towards its appreciation of horror movies, even though they have impacted filmmaking culture arguably more than any other genre. Evil Dead in particular is one of the most influential, with it pioneering the indie film landscape we know today. Peter Jackson has since stated that he would not be where he is today without seeing Evil Dead 2, which would leave us without the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, what is the greatest movie ever made? Well, to really figure that out, we need to understand what constitutes a film in the first place. The idea of a moving picture goes back to the 1890s, with the first films ever made by Thomas Edison and William K.L. Dixon. But those movies really were just tests of motion photography. You'd never hear how a director today was inspired by a William K.L. Dixon film, as the first film in motion picture history is more important from a historical level than in terms of masterful filmmaking. The first movie to be given the title of a full-length feature film would be The Story of the Kelly Gang. Again, while important in the historical sense, you'd never really hear today's filmmakers citing that as their inspiration to start a career in filmmaking. While this movie may be what the next feature-length films would use as a basis, what constitutes a great film is not really how it influences other films, but rather a conjunction of several different aspects of other great films. So, while The Story of the Kelly Gang may have been influential, it doesn't hold up in much other than historical significance today. The innovation of film today is mostly based on the influence of other visionaries, and how they built up on top of each other. This echoed from the popular phrase of, "there are no original ideas." Even some of the most innovative films like Star Wars or Pulp Fiction took heavy inspiration from the films that came before it. There are several similarities between Metropolis and Flash Gordon in Star Wars, while Quentin Tarantino uses scenes straight out of other movies to impact the flow of action, like this scene from Psycho. The categories that award shows often use to define a good film don't include this postmodernist take on culture, but rather break down the essential building blocks of what constitute a well-made film. The categories they follow are stuck to directing, acting, cinematography, screenplay, sound mixing, sound editing, score, and visual effects, while animated films are judged on the quality of the animation of the film rather than its overt quality. Outside of some of these more established categories, as viewers, we look at other aspects, like how a movie can be sustainable over time. For example, what is the movie's cultural significance? How large is the appeal? And what kind of influence will this film have over the future of filmmaking? But then again, all of this is subjective. When it comes to categorizing films like this, it could lead towards the distinct separation growing between the fans and the art itself. Back to the Future is often touted as a classic, and has been made a prime example out of when it comes to not being properly recognized for its efforts, outside of sound editing. There are a lot of other movies like The Dark Knight, which are helmed by creative individuals who are able to create spectacles within the screen that were never once thought possible. The Dark Knight had one of the best performances to have ever been put on screen, with Heath Ledger's masterful performance as the Joker. The practical effects were also groundbreaking, with the effort put into being timeless and innovating. Since it changed so much of what we know about film today, and what we thought possible, there's a great argument to be made about The Dark Knight being the greatest film ever made. When Heath Ledger performed, he was able to get a level of authenticity unseen before from any other actors. When the Joker blew up the hospital in the film, the button he pressed to detonate the explosives didn't work as expected, and when it did go off, his reaction worked in character of the Joker, and played into a masterful performance, which would be impossible to imitate. One of the more recent films, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, was able to come out with almost unanimous praise and support across the board. It was recognized at that year's Oscars, but still is not as well revered as some of the more artistically driven films of the year, or even years previous. Of course, there is Pulp Fiction, which popularized the style of non-linear storytelling, and shot Quentin Tarantino into the stratosphere with his Shakespearean dialogue and masterful storytelling. However, none of these movies compare to the one movie that constantly gets referred to as the magnum opus of filmmaking, Citizen Kane. While often pointed to as the best film ever made, there is still a large group of people out there who do not see it the same way. Even though it's often used as an analogy to describe the best of the best in terms of filmmaking, something as unanimously as appreciated as Citizen Kane can be shown to be just another film. Even though these examples are the more popular movies that we usually hear about, there are lots of people who feel like the best films to come out are the ones that do not get much attention, whether they have smaller independent releases or are not talked about that often and don't get the attention they deserve. Foreign films are also commonly overlooked by the Western audiences, while being some of the most innovative films to spawn within the medium. With the huge cultural admiration of anime, and films like Parasite getting a lot more recognition, this has actually been changing over time. No matter what though, it still shows that there is a disconnect from the movies that people saw and what people consider high art. So, with everything, the question still stands. What constitutes the greatest film ever made? Well, from person to person, you're bound to have a different opinion. It's unfair to try and quantify something like this, but the only way to know for sure is to come up with it yourself, and validate your own opinion. If you want to know what the greatest movie out there is, the best thing to do is to watch as much as possible and make the decision yourself. What is important to know, however, is that the attributes that make up a well-made movie are not always a uniform strategy on quality work in the film industry. While a great movie may have terrific acting, sound, cinematography, directing, and story, as long as it struck a chord with you, the viewer, that's what matters. If you're working on making the best possible movie you can only strive to do the best with the aspects you can control. So with these categories people use to define a well-made film, all you can do is try your best in order to make something that is up to the level you need. When it all comes down to the enjoyment of movies, as long as you enjoy something, let your own opinion structure how you feel about it. And while an artistically satisfying film will always top the list in the Oscars, nothing can beat a simple smile on your face.
Kebert Zella.
If there's one word that describes the film mid-90s perfectly, it would have to be family.
Not the relatives or the people you've grown up with, but rather the people we meet along the way.
Fourth grade, yeah.
Fourth grade, bro.
With the subject matter treading the line towards the darker side of childhood, the relatability between the characters was made so that we can still see humanity in even the most brutal parts of mid-90s. The touchy aspect of our main character's constant abuse from his brother to his run with drugs and alcohol puts a different mindset on the interpersonal connections experienced in the film. With Stevie and his brother, you know that he will always be there for him despite their dysfunctional relationship. It also shows how your friends can even be family, and how they'll stick through you with the rough patches of any kind of relationship. So in this episode, we will go over the various aspects of Jonah Hill's directorial debut mid-90s and what makes it an instant classic. The concept of setting a movie in a certain period is how people got their first impressions of mid-90s. The 4:3 aspect ratio, with all its flaws, helped to create the feeling that this movie was from a 90s time capsule. The director, Jonah Hill, uses this time growing up in LA as the backdrop of the film. He shoots it in a way where it shows off the underrepresented parts of the city. This stays narratively consistent with the film, following our main character Stevie as he continues on with his personal journey of growing up in unfortunate circumstances. It's hard to fully take in your surroundings at such a young age, and you can tell that this was important for Jonah Hill to get across. As a well-established actor outside of film, he uses this chance to represent something that he felt was a large part of his story as a person. Without personal, the movie can feel at times. The idea of making a movie like this helps to show people who've had a similar upbringing in life that they're not alone in feeling the way they do. As Jonah Hill mentions in the commentary, there's no feeling like running away from the cops after skating and getting away with it. Which helps to show that it's not just a movie set on a singular aspect of life itself. While this movie may be about family, friends, and relatability, more appropriately, this movie chronicles growing up and the building blocks of finding your self-identity. Through Jonah Hill's direction, he was able to mostly cast non-actors to play these parts to keep with that same sensibility. The way he let the camera sit on its own, composing it of mostly static shots, represents how important this feeling of authenticity was to Jonah and his crew. The reasoning behind keeping the camera static was to have the performance feel like it was captured rather than set up. Since Jonah Hill's a well-respected actor outside the film, his way of portraying authenticity through this lens comes from his aspirations as an actor and how he reflects on some of the time he spent on films like Superbad. As an actor-director, his ability to lend a hand and understand the people he works with on a different level goes a long way in the performances as they appear on the screen. More artistic filmmaking opportunities brought on by a company like A24 being attached to the project show the category in which this film belongs. The actress Alexa Demie ended up with one of her first roles in this movie, with her only other acting job before being in the film Brigsby Bear, which we've already covered in this series. Estee's character is one of the more important ones in the film with how she impacts Stevie's character development. Her role has helped her get future acting jobs in other A24 projects like Waves and HBO's Euphoria. Lucas Hedges, who played Stevie's brother, was also in Waves and a few other notable movies. Stevie's brother helps develop his character through their brotherly connection, even though it's mostly shown through constant abuse. The scene where he shows remorse for hurting his brother after he comes home drunk is one of the only scenes where we get to see him show his empathetic side. The great detail with his character and the OCD he has shows a commitment towards certain character details. It shows how complex this character is by his surroundings alone. His OCD is something that you wouldn't even really pick up on your first watch. Like, it shows a different side of him, which represents what we don't know about him outside of what we see, and the potential abuse he may have endured. His character is a look into what Stevie's growing up to be, and as Stevie continues on, you get to see that in full action, as he starts up fights and begins to lash out in the same way his brother did. Sonny Suljic's power as the lead of this film is also cleverly shown through the movie. Even with his general lack of experience in acting for that capacity, Jonah Hill and the other crew members have said that working with him was like working with an adult. He understands everything from the mundane to the more expressive directions shown on screen effortlessly, and it helps accentuate the film's more realistic, down-to-earth vibe. For someone as young as him to act inebriated and pull off flawlessly is a testament to his ability as an actor. Some adults have an issue playing an intoxicated person. Even with the ability to act with experience, while smoking pot and doing drugs is not as noticeable as drinking, he can pull it off in such a way that anyone who's been in the situation can understand the smaller nuances between them. And all that comes back around to the idea of family. Having that connection between people who stick through it with you no matter what. The connections you make with the people who are in the same situation that you may be in. The idea of relating. and having a non-conforming group of friends shows how vast the sea of outcasts is. The magazine Big Brother encapsulates the type of lifestyle that Stevie is constantly looking up to. It gives kids like him a look at that life and the glamorous parts that skateboarders loved, while omitting the stuff that mid-90s makes a point to include. With Big Brother and how it evolved into CKY and Jackass, the culture which was influenced by it now has a movie that shows that part of their life that people thought was not there. So when mid-90s turns on the camera, it shows the real things in life that are necessary for understanding the unrepresented part of teenage life in the 90s, and in many ways, now. It's what makes the film mid-90s an instant classic.
For me, rather than kind of tell the audience who a character is, I like to show the audience what a character wants.
The very first inkling was a 14-page book proposal that Ben Mesrick wrote for his publisher Random House. Ben Mesrick is a novelist. He lives in Boston, and he wrote a book proposal about the founding of Facebook, sent it to his publisher. The publisher wanted to set up a simultaneous film deal, so the publisher sent it to Hollywood, and that's how the book proposal got in my hands. And on page 3 of this 14-page book proposal, I said, yes, I'm in.
As a professional screenwriter, Aaron Sorkin had already made a name for himself in and out of the film industry. He had worked previously on The West Wing, a TV show that ran from 1999 to 2006 on NBC. He also wrote the 1995 film The American President and 1992's A Few Good Men, which he developed from the Broadway production. He has gone on to write several other films, like 2011's Moneyball, 2015's Steve Jobs, and 2020's The Trial of the Chicago 7, which he also directed. Today we'll be going over arguably his greatest work, and what many people point to be one of the greatest films ever made: The Social Network. Since studios don't usually produce a film that is expected to be almost 3 hours long, Sorkin had to convince the company that bought his script, Sony, that it would be right under the 2-hour mark. The reason most screenplays clock in at around 120 pages is because each page usually clocks in at a minute of footage on screen. Everything from 1917 to It Chapter 1, from Star Wars to The Incredibles. At 164 pages, the length of The Social Network screenplay is quite long to be a conventional movie. But this isn't your conventional movie, and Aaron Sorkin isn't your conventional writer. A script at 164 pages would clock in at 2 hours and 44 minutes, which would be difficult to put into theaters. The theater industry usually spaces out all their films to play as many movies as they can. When you have a movie that is teetering the line of 3 hours, it takes more time to play the film in the cinema, giving other movies less time in the theater. This causes certain theaters to suffer from a potential loss of revenue, which is why the majority of films are only 2 hours or less. While some movies like The Avengers Endgame have come out with their abnormally long runtime, they had the promotional backing of a large studio franchise to ensure that it would be more beneficial in the long run. The Social Network did not have any such benefits, so Sorkin had to meticulously craft his dialogue to be read aloud fast, filled to the brim with snarky responses. He also added some long scene headers which may ensure his screenplays are longer than they need to be. This is why his script is not 120 pages, even though it's the same length as one. A long monologue takes up more space, and Sorkin's scripts are filled to the brim with them. While showing executives at Sony his screenplay, Sorkin had to do a live table read with every line of the screenplay to prove the studio executives that he stayed within the 2-hour mark. The majority of Sorkin's other screenplays work this way as well, which is why Aaron Sorkin is usually referred to as a non-conventional screenwriter. The reason he can take a script that is almost 200 pages and get 2 hours out of it shows that Sorkin knows his way around the written page very well. Some of the most dramatic parts of Sorkin's screenplays are also the parts you would never see on screen. From the first line of The Social Network, he writes, "From the black we hear," which doesn't sound out of place for a Nine Inch Nails track, but for a Facebook biopic, it foreshadows the tone of the film right out of the gate. Coincidentally, Nine Inch Nails frontman Trent Reznor and his partner Atticus Ross worked on the score for The Social Network, which won them their first Oscar. David Fincher, the film's director, had been a fan of the band his entire life and had already used some of their music on one of his previous films, Seven. He had already directed one of the band's music videos and knew that they would work perfectly in tandem with Sorkin's dialogue and his vision of uneasiness that he was known for with his previous films. At the time, Facebook was just another website. A biopic at the start of this inherently meaningless website at the time does not seem like it should have held any real stakes. From the Black We Hear shows that there is something else going on here, without a single image shown or a line of dialogue spoken, and the usage of Nine Inch Nails complements almost every aspect of it. It changed the entire outlook of this story from something that had no real significance and made it into a force to be reckoned with. Something that the real-life Facebook would mirror itself. Sorkin's screenplay is filled with delicate little intricacies that make his words pop off the page like no other writer. The first sentence of the screenplay is just the beginning of what is to come from this screenplay, and it shows what to expect from a piece of work like this. In this episode of Film History Digest, Art of Film, we are going to dive deeper into the masterful work of Aaron Sorkin and showcase what makes the first 30 minutes of The Social Network a masterclass in the art of film. When the dialogue starts, Mark is instantly queued up with the conversation about the IQ levels of people in China. This is important as Mark is our main character, and introducing him this way is very important as it shows his lack of understanding of basic human values as he attempts to humble brag. His girlfriend, Erica, is completely understandable from her response. It shows the qualities of her character when she cannot believe Mark's claims. She actively gives into conversation, showing that she does care for Mark despite his lack of perceived empathy for others. It is set up very early on in the screenplay that the people that care for Mark the most are the ones that get hurt the most by him. In Ben Mersrich's book, The Accidental Billionaires, in which Aaron Sorkin based his screenplay for The Social Network, it goes more in depth about this part of the narrative. While this interaction between Mark and Erica is not in the book, there are several just like it where you can make the same inferences. It is not established that they are dating at all yet, but the implication of Erica's rebuttal shows that she has some sort of connection to him. When Mark steps in and says, "We're dating," it works to show a meta-commentary on the fact that it wasn't clear enough, while also resorting as a reminder to the characters themselves. Within the first page and a couple lines of dialogue, we can already infer so much without any sort of visual storytelling or even any scene headers. When these two characters get introduced, Sorkin uses defining details to describe Mark, which does not give away too much of the character, but defines him to a more clear level. It explains how unlikable he is and shows a distinct inaptitude to human emotions. From the first page alone and the knowledge of Mark's being in this film as the founder of the largest social network in the world, there is a clear juxtaposition with the thesis of this film, as it is based on the founder's inability to understand basic social behaviors. It creates a bit of clever irony on which the film bases its cutting satire. With what is shown in the modern times and the current structure of the Facebook landscape, with its cutting political and social ecological values, The Social Network's exaggerations between the real-life Mark Zuckerberg and Sorkin's rendition creates a buddying social satire with what is being shown on screen versus the actual events of what is going on in real life with modern Facebook and other social networks. There are very distinct differences between the real-life Mark Zuckerberg and Aaron Sorkin's overly dramatized Mark Zuckerberg. The commentary Sorkin was trying to produce still stands the test of time today, and shines throughout the rest of the screenplay, even though this is only just the first page. The character of Erica is much more different than the other characters. Her introduction through the scene header is not even about her, but more about her relation to Mark. Sorkin uses her character not to define Erica Albright, but to continue defining Mark Zuckerberg. This is why Erica doesn't have a real-life counterpart, or any mention in the source material. Their conversation continues to define Mark's character when Erica learns about Mark's abnormally high SAT score.
How do you distinguish yourself in a population of people who all got 1,600 on their SATs?
I didn't know they take SATs in China.
They don't. I wasn't talking about China anymore. I was talking about me.
Mark's apparent disregard for her is shown throughout, with him changing the subject, interrupting her, and generally putting her down. When she finally gets a word in on something that gets Mark's attention, it is only when she decides to break up with him that Mark shows a bit of humanity. When Mark realizes the severity of everything, he tries to fix it. The opening scene shows how flawed Mark is, and while it gives the character of Erica a bit more characterization, the job of the scene is more important, for it accomplishes our understanding of who Mark is, from his social interactions alone. While inherently not an important character, Erica sets the plot in motion, which just so happens to be the name of one of the songs in the film's Academy Award-winning score. After the breakup, we get the action line, "With that stinger, Erica walks off. We slowly push in on Mark. A fuse has just been lit." And then the score finally starts. While the song In Motion does not play after the breakup, Hand Cover Bruise introduces the idea of something greater: vulnerability.
When we wrote that, I don't think we were both thinking, here's the main title theme, you know. But seeing it in there, I was amazed, and this is the first time I've done this, but I was amazed at how much the music could change your expectation of the film and your impression, and it set the whole tone. And not that I didn't know music could do that, but seeing it do that, and it was pretty eye-opening and just exciting experience to witness and be a part of.
Trent Reznor and Atticus's score expertly weaves into the dialogue of the scene. And without any lyrics, it is capable of creating music akin to Sorkin's masterful dialogue. While the fuse won't go off right away, it takes a moment before it gets in motion. The way Sorkin shows Mark's response to his breakup is not only relatable to people that have gone onto Facebook after a breakup themselves, but shows the distinct connection that Mark has to the online world. The creeping nature of his actions as he slams his now ex-girlfriend online is a reminder of his humanity, something that is usually lost on Mark's character. Sorkin keeps using the one-line dramatic scene headers more to articulate this fact. This is the only place he is comfortable. When Mark continues to blog, Sorkin cleverly shows the passage of time through the distinct time difference in Mark's blog and his continual inebriation. This is a documentation of events that keeps the pacing in check while progressing the story, developing Mark's character, and creates the first major inciting incident when Mark creates Face Mash. Showing the time passing like this with Mark's increasing inebriation shows how skillful Mark is at computer science. Even though Mark admits to being intoxicated in his blog post, the level of intoxication that Mark is experiencing is not as vivid as it is in the screenplay, but it still comes across in his character's actions. This is alluded to by Sorkin's dialogue for Mark playing over itself. While not too noticeable in the film, it creates a separate allure of the screenplay. While the movie shuffles a few scenes around, it still has the same basic structure of what Sorkin put down. When Andrew Garfield's character, Eduardo Sabarin, is introduced, Sorkin's dialogue makes it hard to understand what is being said. Since the dialogue goes by so fast, the type of conversation they are having goes over most people's heads. It introduces us to Mark's second relationship, the one he has with Eduardo, an interpersonal relationship. What makes this short dialogue exchange so important is how Mark dodges Eduardo's emotions. While Eduardo is trying to help Mark through his breakup, Mark is set on his own goals. It shows not only how Mark disconnects with other people, but even the ones he holds close to him. The way they end the conversation is not by naturally ending Eduardo's side of the conversation, but by letting go and going along with where Mark's head is at. The same way he broke up with Erica, and the same reason why other relationships he gets himself in end up in the same way. This is true for everybody except for Justin Timberlake's character, Sean Parker, who is the only character in the film that Mark is seen looking up to. Sorkin uses this to his advantage, and throughout the entire movie, Mark never really fails. He uses people for what he needs, even Sean Parker. Mark ignores the people in his life, even the people who are closest to him. This is what Eduardo's character symbolizes. It shadows the rise of Facebook, and inevitably, of its antisocial aspects, which is helmed by even the website's creator. When Mark crashes the Harvard network with FaceMash, he deliberately ignores Eduardo, who tells him they should shut it down before they get in trouble. Mark continues to run the website until, inevitably,
You don't think? I do. I see this everybody.
Can't connect.
The network's down. Unless it's a coincidence, I think this is us. It's not a coincidence.
the first time we see Mark in the deposition room, we understand that something went wrong. Sorkin uses this to show that the story is being told through the lens of a deposition. It shows not only his unwillingness to pay attention to the task at hand, but more importantly, it shows that he is uncomfortable with the outlook he has been cast under, dismissing it entirely. Something echoed by the real-life Mark Zuckerberg shortly after the release of the movie. The more important aspect of this scene has nothing to do with Sorkin's dialogue, but more importantly, he foreshadows the falling out between Mark and Eduardo. With no dialogue, we can know that something else happened, and the fact that Eduardo is in the same room is a sign of more things to come. The most important aspect of this scene, however, is not anything visual, but the character description Sorkin gives to show how Mark has progressed not physically, but mentally. The description reads, "Still tortured and complicated, but comfortable now with his power." Not being dressed formally for the deposition showcases a gap in his previous amount of self-awareness. More importantly, it is his first physical demonstration of any unforeseen power. With the previous 17 minutes, we are aware of two large issues Mark is having to deal with: hacking the Harvard network and the falling out with Eduardo, who at this point is nothing but a friend to Mark. These two issues are thrown to the side when the Winklevoss twins are introduced. This change in scenery and the cinematic cut puts these two scenes together to subtly show that they are going to be the next people to bring Mark into the courtroom. They are the personification of everything Mark is jealous of, with Erica's previous comment about being attracted to rowers as the prime indication of how they get under his skin. The Erica Allwright scene at the start of the movie is one of the only parts of the film that was not true, but Sorkin used that to his advantage in this scene by introducing the Winklevoss twins in the very thing his ex-girlfriend said she was attracted to. Sorkin can set up and subtly hint towards his future conflict in this story from something that people would only see as a throwaway line. As we continue, the pieces start to fall together when their friend Divya introduces them to Mark after he caught a note from his impressive feat with the FaceMash scandal. If it was not on the nose enough that Mark would screw them over, Sorkin again changes scenery back to around 3 years later in a second deposition room. Sorkin uses the scene itself to do all the talking by having the Winklevoss twins spell their name out, signifying that they too were screwed over by Mark. They didn't even need to explain them being there. The fact that they were is reason enough to suspect that something bad happened. Cutting back, it showcases a similar but different setting that deals with the fallout from FaceMash in an administrative hearing room. This is the first time chronologically we see Mark in an interrogation-like setting. While the deposition scenes were placed earlier in the script, Sorkin used the little story building he had and developed the point where he could show that time had passed significantly. Progressing further, we get another action line that says the deposition takes place 3 years later. Sorkin knows he needs to show it visually as well, and with the constant scene jumping, they do just that. Back to the administration room, it is physically shown that he is not the powerful Mark Zuckerberg at this point, but he is still the sarcastic asshole you saw getting deposed in the deposition room. The more interesting scene isn't the interrogation, but the scene after. Eduardo, being a nice friend, stays out for him, and Mark's response is still the same as usual, dismissing Eduardo almost completely. Mark knows that Eduardo tried to stop him, but Mark brushes it off to undervalue his contribution. At this point, it builds up to Eduardo's character as a more submissive type. Sorkin knew that he wanted to have this juxtaposition to be the driving force in the story, and it worked to create a really clear vision of where things are going. The Social Network doesn't show much on the education side, so when Sorkin focuses on it, he doesn't pay as much attention to its importance. The small amount we do see is an operating system class that Mark walks out of. When Mark leaves his CS class, we don't know why. Sorkin does a great job at making sure the audience isn't confused for too long, as the scene pays off when Mark runs into the Winklevoss twins. The Winklevoss twins are the personification of everything he is not, but the admirable type that Mark knows attracted Erica. In a way, his interaction with the Winklevoss twins and the subsequent retribution from stealing their idea for the Harvard connection is a form of retribution, which foreshadows the incel community, which has since become a large part of Facebook and internet culture as a whole. Sorkin attempts to use this scene to introduce the Winklevoss lawsuit story thread. While they are already busy men, wanting to create a website would be just another thing to eat up their time. As they said earlier, they do not have time but to practice row and pursue their academics. Using Mark as their coder would help them get their idea finalized, but as we all know, he does not do that. Why Mark is clearly in the wrong here, the Winklevoss twins do not need something like Facebook to be successful. In real life, they would go on to compete in the Olympics, but their run-in with Zuckerberg caused them to lose a very important race and wasted their time to become real athletes. They were great students, even better athletes. Sorkin shows that Mark knows this by showing his distinct lack of attention towards them unless confronted about the situation directly. Even when brought to the proc, Mark pays little attention to the situation. Even though their interaction lasts 6 pages worth of dialogue, Sorkin sums up the entire conversation with one simple line. Mark gives a short shrug that says both, "I don't know," and "fuck you," at the same time. From this scene, we are introduced to Mark's idea for Facebook. While it may seem like the same idea as the Harvard connection that the Winklevoss twins introduced to Mark, it is clear that he is using his ideas to formulate his discovery. Eduardo, who at this point we know has a falling out with Mark, cuts back to the deposition room for less than 30 seconds. He ends Mark's line in the film by saying, "It would be exclusive." This shows that there was some sort of connection between his idea and the Winklevoss twins. Eduardo would use this opportunity to put Mark down again later. However, the scene previously shows Mark's dismissal of Eduardo's getting punched by the Phoenix, which would also imply a misdirection in Eduardo's narrative. Mark's jealousy is the only true emotion he shows throughout the Social Network, besides the possibility of love with Erica Albright.
You got punched by the Phoenix. Yeah. It's probably just a diversity thing. Just a diversity thing. Just ride that horse until... What did you want to talk to me about? Mark? Yeah. You said you'd come up with something. Yeah, I think I've come up with something. Come outside. It's 20 degrees outside. I can't stare at that loop of Niagara Falls, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Caribbean.
Sorkin is a master at introducing several ways of looking at different scenes in all different ways imaginable. While the Niagara Falls comparison might be a personal gripe Mark has, Sorkin uses this as an example to show the possibility of Mark being jealous and having to let his anger out on something else. The same theme of hateful emotions is also weaved throughout. When Mark created Face Mash, It was out of hurt from a breakup, and this idea of what Mark described as his first incarnation of Facebook was based on jealousy. Even his conversation with the Winklevoss twins would not have been sparked unless he left class after he had received the anonymous hate note. The themes of this film hit home, and in the modern world, it's scary how close every aspect of the social network would have with very real repercussions well after the movie came out. Sorkin's script is his best work, and understanding him is understanding this screenplay. It develops these themes for a very important reason. As modern Facebook tears people apart and the interconnectivity continues to divide us more and more, Sorkin alludes to it all happening from the beginning. Facebook was invented from these very same motivators. The only question that we can continue to ask ourselves is, where does it go from here? Thanks for watching.
When it comes to television, the landscape is quite different in comparison to movies. The advancement of technology dictates the direction that the future of film will take. Even though the regular big movie companies like Paramount Pictures, Warner Brothers, Universal Studios, Columbia Pictures, and Walt Disney Studios all have their ownership over broadcast television, the landscape is quite different. With the radical emergence of streaming, however, we have started to see this line between television and film get blurred even more. With Netflix entering the picture, it drastically changes how we consume content when compared to how we used to. With YouTube and VR content entering the mainstream, who knows what the future has in store? With the major changes that streaming has brought to the entertainment landscape, contemplating the future of the medium's development can only help produce an accelerated evolution of quality content. Because the emergence of new technology has given individuals more power in the modern era, it becomes more difficult to know what the future of media may hold. In this episode of Film History Digest, we will try to go over the current trends in the media landscape and where we expect it to go from here. From streaming platforms, virtual reality, to other areas which encapsulate the idea of postmodernism, in this episode of Film History Digest, we will try to go over the current trends and where we expect it to go from here. Sit back and relax as we go over the future of media. Beyond the traditional realm of what has been either a show or a movie, the innovation of film and television is slowly shifting over to AR and VR content. While it is fair to say that they will never overtake traditional movies, the experience they have been able to keep with their advancements in technology show a promising future ahead of itself. Big Picture has given users the ability to watch movies in a theatrical environment, which has grown in popularity due to the 2020 pandemic. There have been several experiences in VR and tech demos showcasing the potential power of this technology. Valve's game, Half-Life Alyx, took advantage of the VR experience and created a game that fully utilized the technology. There have been several 3D movies made to test out VR capabilities, with certain Marvel films gaining VR experiences to coincide with their respective movies. As time goes on, these little projects and tests will grow and grow to the level at which we saw Half-Life Alyx. These new virtual worlds are something that cannot be ignored, with the Oculus Quest making it simpler, easier, and more affordable than ever. The install base for VR content is only going to grow further and further. For the advancements that VR has done to gaming content, its potential for film is still left underutilized. If trends are to be followed and understood, there should be an influx of more narrative storytelling coming to VR in the future. Legendary video game company Nintendo has spoken about changing the movie-going experience with their talk of a theatrical Zelda experience using the AR capabilities of 3DS. However, Nintendo made that statement back in 2013, and with the Nintendo 3DS being discontinued as of 2020, it's fair to assume that they are no longer going through with that exact plan. With the upcoming animated Mario Bros. Movie, Nintendo's interest in extending past the video game industry has been more and more clear lately. Facebook's AR development is also in the works, and the innovations within the VR field with the Oculus Quest have also opened the possibility for a more mainstream experience, like what Nintendo spoke of back in 2013. Even though this new immersive tech seems to be the future of media, there are other more nuanced areas in which film, in the more traditional sense, is starting to develop past what we see it as today. The Netflix interactive film Black Mirror Bandersnatch has been a great example of something that has passed beyond what is considered a movie, TV show, or even a video game. As an interactive film, Bandersnatch not only plays with the traditional viewing experience of a movie, but the length of what we would consider one. As to keep with the themes of the Black Mirror TV show, this approach of a film adaptation not only keeps in line with the viewpoint of the show itself, but develops it past what is even considered a movie in its own right. The biggest difference between Netflix and the companies that controlled TV and film that came before was the fact that Netflix was not just about TV or film, but reinventing the wheel entirely. However, Netflix paid an equal amount of attention to TV and film and gave it equal real estate on its website, breaking down the boundaries of both mediums. Unlike other production studios like 20th Century Fox, which had developed subsidiaries like FX and Searchlight, everything on Netflix is given the same spotlight under its system that the platform itself revolutionized. Since Netflix is put in such a unique situation, it has led towards the organic melding of film and television together into an interconnected sense, which stripped away the limits of being stuck to a specific medium. One of Netflix's biggest shows, Stranger Things, has had its subsequent seasons titled differently to reflect the naming conventions of a film, rather than a traditional television show. This changed the medium what we considered a show in larger regard than just the simple changing of a season name, and worked within the narrative context of the show's plot structure. For a show to be treated like a movie and given the same resources, it creates a show which defies conventions and gives the producers and directors the most creative freedom possible. The prospect of being able to adapt a novel to the big screen like what was originally intended is now possible. Stranger Things and its constant comparisons to Stephen King's books show how it has felt to certain people to be an adaptation rather than a wholly original idea. The span of what was considered traditional television continues to change. If you look at previous attempts to adapt projects through a forum like a miniseries with what has been seen with previous Stephen King properties, it shows that they don't turn out the best. It is noticeable that these miniseries have had a lack of budget and resilience in the public consciousness, especially when compared to the larger scale of a project like Stranger Things. Some of these miniseries were made into more successful film adaptations like with the It films, but Stranger Things fits into the mold of being virtually impossible to do the same with. Stranger Things opens the potential of showing these sorts of narratives on whatever screen suits it best, which just so happens to be the small screen. Even adaptations like the 2 It films that came out are overly long while still having to omit a large deal from its source material. If there is anything that Stranger Things shows and other series like it, it's that the stories that have always wanted to be told are finally getting the ability to be fully envisioned, with smaller and smaller intervention in ways of technological hindrance or budgetary reasons. Shows like Breaking Bad have also helped to pave the way for this style of storytelling. It also shows how something like Breaking Bad, with its continuous 62 long hour narrative, would not make sense to make a film adaptation of the show over something like a TV special or new season. In the past, the point of making a movie was to be able to tell this more grandiose story and do stuff that you would not usually be able to get away with on American television. Breaking Bad is a show that could not be done as a 2-hour-long film adaptation, so when Netflix produces a Breaking Bad movie, it demonstrates the practicality of the feature, as it shows to cap off the show as a whole rather than being a straight adaptation to tie off the show's loose ends. Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight extended cut is important to point out, as essentially it is trying to do what Stranger Things did, but in reverse. So what is considered a movie or TV show is constantly changing. As one of the only film directors in Hollywood today who still works to create wholly original movies, Tarantino testing out this new way of delivering his movie is a big change for films. Tarantino's movie Pulp Fiction was known for being a movie that single-handedly innovated the filmmaking process and changed the way people look at developing their projects. The ways Pulp Fiction was able to change TV and film is unfathomable, as it has gone on to have such a large imprint on the world of filmmaking. After Pulp Fiction and Tarantino's hit after hit, every one of his films has gone on to drastically change the outlook people have had on the medium. So for Tarantino to come out and change the options and how the movie-going audience consumes his films is a statement to the future of how future films will be represented. With the length of The Hateful Eight and several other Tarantino movies, it makes sense that changing the movie into an episodic forum could benefit the experience. While the length may be exceedingly long, on the same platform, Netflix has been shown to do the exact opposite. The Lonely Island made their unauthorized Bash Brothers experience, which pushed the envelope even further in terms of what is considered a movie, being referred to as a visual poem. As the visual content continues to develop further and further, this level of experimentation has led these visionaries behind the projects to think further outside the bounds of where the industry has paved the way previously. While the prospect of what we consider films and the methods we experience it in is changing, the ways that traditional media is changing is quite different. While the more experimental take on the film is great for creating new technological advances to the medium, the future of television and film is still very much in the air. Clearly, streaming is still paving the way for the future. The advantages Netflix has brought to the board, along with what the 2020 pandemic has done to movie theaters, streaming is turning out to be the next best place for film. Even though directors like Christopher Nolan would rather have their films shown on a giant IMAX screen, going forward, the theatrical experience will be whittled down to more of a novelty. For television, we are seeing a looser grasp that the FCC has been having on showrunners, with their standards and practices helping them get away with more and more. The creators of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia has been quoted as saying that he felt that FXX was able to give them as much freedom as they wanted. So they felt they had no reason to do a movie, even though it would have given them a chance to tell a larger scale story. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, have stated that they could make the South Park movie today in around 2 weeks with the crew they have now, which is why they have spent more of their time fleshing out larger narratives in the 2 RPG video games, which have 40 hours worth of content between the 2 games. These 2 examples have shown that the real need that was felt for another film adaptation of a project is not as much of a priority in this day and age, since there are more mediums to work in than ever. The scale of creativity lends no limits to how far the projects can go. As we continue with life and we decide what forms of media we want to watch, we will continue to see changes to how we take in these forms of media. While we might see a film today as a fundamental part of the entertainment industry, there will be a time when it becomes phased out, just like broadcast television has. Technology has not come anywhere close to phasing out the traditional film medium, but it's something to pay attention to going forward. With AT&T attempting to sell off DirecTV, it shows where the future of media is, and is the first pillar in the fall of broadcast television, which has been a mainstay in homes for the last 100 years. With the innovations of film and the convenience of these new ways to take in our technology, it shows a distinct paradigm shift towards the future of media.
Please take a look at the final new challenger in Super Smash Bros.
The year 2020, the start of a new decade, a time of freedom, limitless ideas for the future, and the start of something new. For some, this signified hope, but for others, it signified dreams. The date of January 1st, 2020 was an important one, for it ushered in a new world of innovation and creativity. It also started one of the biggest creative endeavors from one of the smallest freelance teams on the internet.
I've been a part of this channel since, well, before it was a glimpse in anyone's eye. We've known each other for around 7 or 8 years. I got to know him through the comment section of a YouTube video. We became friends and started talking on and off a bit before we started working more heavily together.
When Lewis and I started Film History Digest, it was the first time we ever set out to do something with an actual end goal. Lewis and I were the ones who started developing it, but we had plans to have other people on board. But at the end of the day, it was mainly just Lewis and I who worked on the majority of it.
Working on a project like this has been a crazy undertaking, but we've both worked really hard to make sure it continued month to month. And even though we've mostly stuck to that, it's proven to be one of the biggest undertakings we've taken on.
Putting these finishing touches on this project has been really important to Lewis and I, because it's something that we've worked really hard for, and We really want to make sure it gets the sense of conclusion and we end it the way that we really want it to. So with that said, in this last episode of Film History Digest, let's take you behind the scenes and show you what it was like to work on Film History Digest. Let us begin.
I remember the first time I noticed a shift in the type of content that our friend group was making. When I saw the first Yellow Syrup video, which that was before it was Film History Digests, I realized that we could be doing a lot more with the tools we had. At the time, I felt like this signified a paradigm shift within our community, but looking back at it and the stuff we were making compared to what we're doing now, it wasn't as good.
I remember where I was when the Maker video came out. I was just starting high school and I was coming out of some hard patches. I wasn't too focused on anything else and I had just stopped working on my personal channel. I had a little bit of success, but I started to realize I didn't have enough consistency with my content to do really anything eventful or to be taken seriously as a creator or an artist. I'd always kind of wanted to be a part of something bigger than who I was, and I never really had the opportunity, but when I saw the Maker video, that was the first time I remember thinking, I could do something like this.
The first video that I helped work on was the Rated R Disney Movies video. We were really proud of that. We thought we had made something special. And from there, we kept pumping out video after video. But it wouldn't be long until it continued to get more difficult.
One of the more difficult parts about working on this type of content was the fact that I had just started high school. I had just entered my own personal YouTube channel a while back, and I was trying to focus more and more on academics, so putting on a YouTube channel like this was really big and difficult at the time, and I didn't know if I could do it, but as I continued on in my academics, I started to realize how much passion I had in filmmaking and storytelling as a medium.
I started to recognize that we were both becoming a lot stronger as creators, and I continued to work on my projects, Nathan continued to work on his short films, and he even got one entered into a film festival. But taking on this project really added a lot onto our plate. At this point, we were both really burnt out, and you could tell with how crazy the upload schedule was. It clearly showed that there were some problems.
One of the harder parts about working on Yellow Syrup was the fact that those last 3 videos took like a year each to make because my hardware kept crashing and editing just turned into a slog, and it was really difficult to really get anything done, but I remember I worked really hard every single day and I tried to get them done as best I could, and I think I remade a couple of them like a few times because the editing software just kept crashing and crashing, but I remember really spending a year on those last 3 videos, and I knew if I was going to do anything consistent, then I need to update my hardware specs and really go all in. I remember that Forgotten Marvel Movies video was really difficult, and that's the one that took me the longest, especially since I was just getting used to working on Premiere and transitioning over all my assets and everything over to a school computer, and it just became really tough. It was at this point when we realized what we were doing just really wasn't working out.
The original creator of the channel was barely involved, and it was just me and Nathan working on them together. The way it worked is that Nathan would do a lot of the writing and editing while I did a lot more of the heavy-duty graphic design elements, but I would also advise on ideas and help review some scripts and stuff like that. You know, when you've been working on a video for a bit over a year, you start to realize how much work you've been putting into it, just for it to never be seen.
We were getting really tired of the copious amounts of copyright claims and the general lack of communication between team members, so Lewis and I came to a conclusion that something needed to change.
You know, the first time I heard the idea of Film History Digests, I just thought, wow, that's going to be a lot of work.
The idea was this: we're hitting the end of an era, and as we're growing more and more creatively, and we're growing older and older and becoming adults, we're leaving high school and we're leaving all this behind. And so we thought if we're going to leave this part of our life behind, we might as well set it off in a great finale. And in my opinion, and in Lewis's opinion, Film History Digest was the best way to go. I remember I really did try to make this channel connect, and hook onto the algorithm. I'm not gonna lie, I really did try hard, and I wanted to have the metadata be really well done and the thumbnails be beautiful and do trending topics and have them catch the algorithm in length. But I also remember when I pressed create channel button right there when the clock hit 12, that even if it didn't, then it would still be worth it to me in the long run.
Before we launched the channel, I remember Nathan telling me that he didn't think it was going to succeed. And while I was more hopeful, I think there was a part of me that still believed him. In the end, turned out he was right. When people said that they didn't do it for the views, I always sort of saw that as a lie, because if you don't want your video to be seen, then why are you making it? But for Nathan, he was the only one that I actually believed.
We did start making videos back in 2020. We tried stockpiling 12 videos, but as the year went along, we started to realize that we couldn't really do that, and we ended up pushing back a lot of those videos into 2021 and working on them then too. I do remember how the year started, and I thought it was honestly off to a good start. I was accomplishing a lot and doing a lot of great things, but as it kept going along, that's when it started to get pretty hard. I remember editing the last couple of Film History Digest videos with flash bombs going on outside my window. It was pretty difficult, but I just kept thinking to myself, as long as I can help one person get through this time, it would be worth it in the end, you know?
I remember watching the Beavis and Butthead video, and actually thinking this channel had some potential. It was one of the few projects that I've worked on that have actually seen some kind of success.
I remember being surprised at the success, and I don't remember thinking really much of it when I put it out, but I'm glad we were able to do as much as we were with it, and I was able to get the reception it did, really.
Well, I gotta say, man, I mean, there was 2 or 3 moments in that where I actually choked up, and yeah, just I don't know you that well or your narrator guy, but I'm very, very proud of you. That was very important. Thank you for doing that.
Getting that message really meant a lot to me. It's something that I've always worked towards, is making the same type of impact that other people have made on my lives, and hearing that I was able to do that to just one person just means more to me than pretty much anyone can ever imagine. I've worked my entire life to try to make as much as I could and attempt to work as hard as I could to do whatever I can to benefit as many people as possible. And that message was the first time I've actually heard from a personal account how something I've done made a difference in someone's life. And it just meant a lot to me.
One of the biggest challenges is that me and Nathan are fairly dyslexic. It makes it really hard to write scripts, especially when you're jumbling together the words and writing in ways that are more unconventional. We tried our best to mitigate the problems, but when I'm the only one reviewing the scripts, it makes things really difficult. There were still some mistakes that slipped through the cracks, but overall, this was one of the hardest parts for us.
For me, there was several challenges I had while working on this project. I had developed COVID a while back, and that made it pretty difficult to focus on pretty much anything, let alone edit videos or write scripts. Another issue I have is I deal with anxiety and depression, which makes it hard to get out of bed sometimes. And but I just remember if I'm able to accomplish what I set out to do, then I can go and do it. And that's how I was able to work on these videos and really try to give it my all, you know?
As we finish up this series, we both plan to continue with our own stuff. I plan on live streaming some more and hopefully schedule my content in a way that's more consistent.
What I plan on doing after this is, well, a lot. I mean, I do want to focus on school. I'm a sophomore right now, and I'm trying to finish up to get my film degree, but I'm also working on several other projects while I'm doing that. One of the main projects that I'm working on is this screenplay called Going Local. It's a story about 2 boys that run away from home and end up having the best parts of life, but also some of the worst. And it's something that's really personal for me, and I've been working on it for the last 4 years. And I really want to put my time and effort into that when I can, and see where I can go with it and see how well I can develop it. I'm also working on a few other scripts other than that, but that's the one that I really want to focus on for the time being.
If we were to continue the channel, we would have to grow, expand, and go bigger, which isn't something that can be done when the channel's being run like this.
It's always my plan to have a more self-contained showcase so I can point at something and say, hey, look what I'm capable of. I did this, you know? And before I didn't really have that.
Before I leave one last time, I just wanted to say that working on this project has been a blast, and I feel personally lucky to have been a part of it.
For me to sign off is like parting with a child. I've worked so hard to build this and put all my love and put everything I could into this series. Lewis and I are going to continue on to make as much as quality content as we can, but for Film History Digest, this is goodbye.
And if I were going to say one last thing, it would be to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching.
Life well spent!